just joined us, great to have you with us in the session. I see our numbers of attendees are slowly creeping up, but we have lots to cover today. So I think in the interests of time, we'll get started with the session. So firstly, a big welcome and hello to this half day of training on applying the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards. I'm Fiona from the UN SSE team, and I'll introduce some of my colleagues who are joining us for today's session a little bit later as well. But firstly, just to say this programme is a truly collaborative effort, really driven by that demand we're seeing in the market for more support to understand, implement the IFRS S1 and S2 standards. So we'd like to express our sincere thanks to the IFRS Foundation and IFC for their support to make this programme possible. And of course, a big thank you today in particular to the Macedonian Stock Exchange for convening us all and hosting today's session. And finally, of course, a big thank you to all of you as participants for taking the time out of your days to join us as well. So to get us started, I'm very pleased to be joined by Carolina, who is Head of Sector for Development, Promotion and Public Relations at the Macedonian Stock Exchange. So Carolina is going to just be kicking us off with a welcome remark. So many thanks for joining us, Carolina, and over to you.
Thank you, dear Fiona. So, dear guests, colleagues, and participants, on behalf of Macedonian Stock Exchange, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's workshop. We are especially proud to serve as a co-organizer together with our partners, as the topic we are addressing today is of crucial importance for the future of financial market and also corporate governance. So the implementation of these sustainability standards, it's not only a regulatory obligation, but also an opportunity for companies to strengthen their transparency, build investor confidence, and enhance their competitiveness in international markets. Our role as a stock exchange is to foster an environment where companies can grow and develop in line with these global best practices. So I believe that today's workshop will provide practical knowledge, useful guidance, and also inspiration for all participants. So I wish you a successful session and also fruitful discussions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Carolina. Yeah, fully agree with all of that. And I hope we'll very much be able to support in those areas with the session today. So a big thank you again. Okay, perfect. So with that, I'll get started with covering off a few housekeeping points and an overview of today's agenda and speakers. So firstly, for those of you who are joining as participants, you've probably noticed by now that you are muted. However, that really doesn't mean that we don't want your participation in the session. So we really do encourage you to make use of the chat box, as I see many of you are already doing, and also the Q&A function as well to ask your questions. This session is a real fantastic opportunity, as you'll see, to ask your technical questions of our colleagues at the IFRS. So if you have any particular questions, make sure you post those into the Q&A box, as that allows us to track and respond to those directly. And then for any general comments as we move along, feel free to share those in the chat. And we'll also be using the chat, as you see from Tiffany there, to share with you some guidance and links to different resources throughout the session. So please keep an eye on those. So in terms of the format for today, as you're probably aware, we have a 3.5-hour live session, and we also have the optional exercise that you can follow on with as homework. This is a voluntary exercise, but something that can help to continue your learning. So we'll tell you a little bit more about that later. And then, as I've already mentioned, we have live Q&A throughout in chat, so make sure to make use of that opportunity to ask your questions. And we really do encourage your participation in the session as well as attendees. So we'll be using a number of interactive tools, including Menti and polls. So we'll explain more about those soon, but please do make sure to engage in those participation exercises as well. And finally, as a recognition of your time to take part in the session today, we'll also be able to offer you a completion certificate at the end of the course. So to get your certificate, you'll need to take part in a survey, which we'll share with you at the end of the programme. And then just to introduce who's going to be delivering the training for you today. So I'm joined by my colleague, Tiffany. Hi, Tiffany, who's the head of the SSE Academy. And as I've mentioned, I'm Fiona within the SSE Academy team. And we're also joined by our colleagues from the IFRS Foundation's capacity building team as well. And today we have with us Robert and Bella. And so getting into the learning objectives from the training today, we have three key areas that we're hoping to help you advance through our training session. So firstly, we'd like to help you to understand the ISSB standards, the fundamental concepts of what sits behind them. We'd then like to help you to understand how you can start to use and apply those ISSB standards in your own contexts. And finally, we'll work through identifying the steps that can be taken to develop a disclosure plan to apply the ISSB standards. So keep in mind as we move through the training that those are the three key areas that we're looking to advance today. And to help us achieve that, we've developed a 4-module structure for our training program, which you'll see in that wheel diagram there. So we'll come back to this a few times during the training and hopefully a helpful way to know where you are in the session contents. So the 4 key areas that we'll be covering today will be prepare. So that's really about building on existing knowledge you might have about sustainability reporting. What is its purpose? How has the landscape of reporting standards evolved to reach the global baseline that the ISSB standards have set today? Excuse me. And then we'll move into align. And this is all around setting the direction and setting the railroad tracks for your disclosures. So thinking about how you can apply and use the standards and what additional disclosures you may need to add to meet particular regulatory or geographical requirements. We're then going to move into implement, and this is all around the practices and systems that you're going to need to adopt internally to help you to identify, evaluate, integrate sustainability risks and opportunities within your organizations. And then finally, we'll finish with communicate. And so this is all around the final format for your reporting and disclosure. So thinking about its location, the timing, and how to report efficiently and provide confidence to users of reporting. Okay, and just to show you how that breaks down across the time for the session, you'll see we've sort of spread the 4 modules across the course. We have quite a lot to cover in Align, so that is the chunk of a lot of our content in Module 2. But you'll be pleased to see we do take a short break in the middle of the session. We know 3.5 hours is a long time to concentrate online, so a quick opportunity to refresh in the middle of the session. And then we'll wrap up towards the end with some more information about that homework assignment and some additional resources that you can take away to support your journey. So as I said, we'll make sure we have some opportunities for interaction and participation as part of each module. And as I said, please do feel free to ask your questions on an ongoing basis in the Q&A box, and we'll respond to those in the background whilst we're not presenting. So please do make sure to ask those. So just to cover a few of the key resources that you'll want to refer to for today's session. So firstly, we have the training materials for the session. So Tiffany has already shared with you just there the link in the chat to access these materials. So if you go to the event page for today's session and look at the resources section at the bottom of that page, you'll be able to access the slide presentation so that you can follow that along, look at the examples in more detail and follow any of the links that we talk about. And there's also access there to the homework assignment as well, so that you can find that to take away for your own learning as well. We will also be posting the recording from today's session as well to that page after the session as well. And so I've mentioned a couple of times the homework assignment. So the focus of this, as I said, is not to be a mandatory thing that you need to complete or submit to us, but really something that can support your own learning and continue to help you build from the conversations we have today to implement the standards within your organization. So the focus of the homework assignment is around developing this draft disclosure plan for your organization. And we're going to do a number of interactive exercises in the training today that can help you start your thinking to feed into the contents of that disclosure plan as well. And there's a few other key resources that we'd like to highlight at the start here that are really, we think, foundational to the contents we've developed here and hopefully really helpful to support you in practically adopting these standards. And these form the SSE's ISSB toolkit, which you can either use that QR code there, or Tiffany's also shared the link in the chat with you there to access this. And this includes a number of key tools. So we have the model guidance, which goes into more detail on each of the 4 units that we'll cover today. and a number of topic-specific resources as well on transition planning and climate-related metrics. And we also have a gap analysis checklist to really work through and help you to understand what disclosure gaps you might have against the standards as well. Okay, so to kick us off with a bit of an interaction, we've got our first opportunity to use Menti together. And we'll be coming back, as I've said, to Menti a number of times in the session. So I encourage you to find your access to this now and to keep that tab available as we'll use the same link throughout the session. So Tiffany's just shared with you in the chat the link to access Menti. So the easiest way to join will just be to click through on that link that Tiffany has shared. But I'll share my screen now as well, and there'll be another couple of ways that you can join us in the session as well. So we also have there two more options to join us. So firstly, you can scan that QR code that is available at the bottom of the screen, and that will take you into this. And you can also go to menti.com and enter that 4-digit code that you can see in the dark colored box at the top of the screen there. 8-digit code, I think, in fact. So great. So our first question in Menti, just to get us all started, is to get a sense from everyone here as to why you're joining us in today's session. So if you can just share in 3 words, if you have them, your own kind of reasons for joining today and what you're hoping to get out of the training, that'd be great. So I'm seeing a few responses coming through already, which is great. So we've got a mention of transparency, maybe knowledge improvement, maybe getting some expertise. I've seen learning, disclosure, sustainability. That's fantastic. All things very much in the focus for today. So I hope things we can support you with, absolutely. ESG, new perspectives, learning again. I think I see practices maybe and implementation, building awareness. Maybe some of you are a bit curious. So that's always a good mindset to come to these sessions in indeed. Great. Okay, I see lots of you starting to get the hang of this, so that's fantastic. So we'll move on though to our second quick opener question now. And this is just to get a sense of those 3 areas that we talked about at the beginning of the session. So the 3 objectives that we have from today. And to get a real sense from you as to where your current understanding is at on these topics or comfort. So if you start on the left-hand side of the scale, that would be not comfortable at all, or maybe very new to this. And then on the right-hand side of the scale, maybe you're very comfortable, maybe you're already implementing things in this space and you've got your head around the standards. So if you can use that sliding scale just to let us know where you're at today in your current understanding on explaining the ISSB to your colleagues, on using the standards, and on developing a sustainability reporting strategy, that would be great just for us to get a sense of where your current knowledge is at. Great, thank you to those who've voted already. I think we're seeing overall, probably most of us are feeling that we are maybe in the middle to lower level of confidence on these topics at the moment, and maybe in particular on the specifics of using the ISSB standards, which of course is understandable and what we're hoping to help you work forward with today. So great to get that understanding. Great. Yes. And as Tiffany says, we do encourage you to share these responses directly in Menti, but if you're having any issues accessing Menti, please let us know and we'll do our best to help you with that. Perfect. Thanks for voting on that, everyone. So I'll take us back now into the slide presentation and we'll get started with our first segment of Module 1. Okay, so before we go into that, I just have a quick disclaimer to share with you all that I'll leave for you to review. And the purpose here is really just to be clear about how we're going to be using disclosure examples in today's training. These are really simply here to add some colour to what we're talking about, because we know, of course, that seeing a real example can often help to put into practice the theory that we're talking about. However, these examples shouldn't necessarily be seen as the best or the right way to approach these topics. Of course, we know that each company has its own unique circumstances and best way to adopt these things. So please just take these as an inspiration, but not specifically any endorsement of these organizations. All right, so with that established, I'll get us started on our first content area. So in Prepare, we're really looking to build that solid foundation of knowledge. And to do so, we generally like to cover 3 aspects here. So we firstly start with the purpose and the why behind sustainability related disclosure. So thinking about what the market and business drivers are that might be leading to this focus as companies have on this topic. And then we move into landscape. So this is all around how we've developed to the point we're at today with the reporting landscape and how it's becoming simplified. And then we'll finish off with the global baseline. So this is all around the core concepts and requirements in IFRS S1 and S2 that set that global baseline. Okay, so to get us started with the why aspect, we'll go first into purpose. And as I said, this is all around the different drivers and market case that there might be for disclosure. So I think a great starting point for that is really just to get a sense from everyone here on kind of what your drivers are for joining us in the training session. So I'll just launch this poll now, and maybe you can let us know in particular, what are your reasons for disclosing sustainability related information? And you can select more than one option here if you've got multiple drivers. But maybe it's regulation, maybe it's sharing your own management's objectives, maybe it's societal expectations and perhaps peer and competitor pressure to benchmark against others in your sector. Maybe you're seeing investor demand, or maybe you have other reasons as well. So feel free to share in the chat if there's anything that we haven't mentioned there that you think is a relevant driver for you. And maybe as well, you aren't disclosing at all yet, and this is just your first time getting to understand this topic, which of course is no problem as well. Okay, so I'll just give everyone a few more seconds to respond to those polls. And we'll be doing these a number of times throughout the session, and we always like to see as many of you taking part as possible. So encourage you to vote, even if you don't have the correct, we don't know your right answer, just have a go and let us know what you think about these things. Brilliant. Okay, so I'll end that poll there now and share those results with you. So we're seeing for many of you, it seems, that regulatory requirements is the top driver here. So I think that's a common picture that we see across many markets globally for focusing on the standards. So all very understandable. And then it looks like our second place is really coming at investor interest there. But many of you kind of mentioning some of the other drivers as well as important for you too. So really useful for us to understand those two kind of key focus areas for you there. So thanks for letting us know that. Hey. So just to cover a little bit on some of those different drivers, a lot of you mentioned there that investor interest was one of the key factors for focusing on this topic. And so that's a common thing that we're seeing globally as well. So the data we're showing you here is the number of signatories to the Principles for Responsible Investment, which is now over 5,000 globally, representing 128 trillion US dollars in assets under management. So I think you'll agree based on that graph that we've seen a real strong uptick in focus from investors if we compare back to maybe 2016 or so before that big increase. So what is it that's driving really this interest that we're seeing from the investor community? So I think a key thing that we want to highlight behind this investor interest is that the relevance of this and the demand for this information is often connected to the financial effects of sustainability topics. So this data that we're seeing here is from a study of retail investors, which was carried out by Morgan Stanley. And in this survey, they found that the top driver for at least these individual investors, which was driving their interest in sustainability, was actually the financial performance and relevance of this information. So I think what's important to highlight here is that while some investors are focused on these topics for impact, increasingly the financial relevance of sustainability factors is becoming apparent as well. So you can take a little bit more look at that survey as well if you'd like to by following the link in the handout. But I've mentioned a few phrases there relating to financial performance. So there's a few key terms that we'd like to cover off first to explain some of the concepts we're going to talk about here. So it's important to remember that the focus for this topic is on the financially material sustainability related information. So we'll talk a bit later in the workshop about what we mean specifically by material in the IFRS context. But we also want to be clear from the start about the sorts of financial effects that investors are looking to have more information on. So firstly, we'll start with the effects on a company's performance. And we often see this in the statement of profit or loss, which shows income or revenue and expenditure. And so sustainability related risks and opportunities can have a financial effect by changing the revenue mix or total revenue of a company. For example, if demands for its products and services change, perhaps its production capacity could be disrupted as a result of climate-related events, for example. And we can also see substantial changes in expenditure. If, for example, operating costs might increase due to rising energy prices, or if there's a need to invest more in R&D to capitalize on sustainability related opportunities, or, for example, to deploy new practices to meet an emissions regulation. And so the other thing that you'll often hear us talking about today are effects on a company's financial position. So let's have another look also at what we mean by that. So we often see a company's financial position reflected on their balance sheet, known as a statement of financial position. So for example, a company might experience changes to certain assets or liability due to sustainability issues. So for example, we could see changes to portfolio values, or possibly we could even see write-offs of certain assets that are damaged or need to be repriced. And another financial effect that should be documented is changes to financing and the cost of capital. So for example, this could include insurance premium increases as a result of climate risks, or perhaps also making use of new financial structures such as green or social bonds. So a few different examples there of how different aspects of financial performance and financial position might play out in relation to sustainability risks and opportunities. And so before we move into our next unit of the module, I also wanted to flag two really important concepts of sustainability related risks and opportunities, which are both really essential to our understanding of them and our disclosures. So what we're seeing here, as you might be familiar with, is data from the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report. And this shows I guess, the difference between the risks that might be front of mind in a 2-year or shorter time frame, and actually the fact that these could change when we look out over 10 years or a longer term horizon. And so that's with something we need to keep in mind for disclosure. If we're preparing for the risks that we're expecting to see 5 or 10 years from now, it might be that we need to take investment or action today to mitigate potential negative impacts in the future. And what that could mean is that we actually see financial effects relating to those risks or opportunities on a much shorter term horizon than when the risk itself is expected to manifest. So that's something to keep in mind during our training today, and something we'll come back to a few times. The time horizons can be a little bit different here, and it's important to bear in mind that we could be experiencing meaningful kind of effects today that we need to start properly reporting and disclosing. And so the second important aspect that I wanted to highlight relating to risks and opportunities on sustainability is their interconnectivity. So this visual also comes from the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report. And as you can see here, there are many interconnections between different ESG risk types. So whilst people might think about the ISSB standards as two separate disclosure topics, one on climate and one on other sustainability topics, however, of course, in practice, all of these issues are very much interconnected. And so we have to consider that whole and try to think holistically when we're making strategic decisions about these topics internally. And similarly, when we're disclosing information, we also need to keep in mind that interconnection. And so, for example, if you're preparing your disclosures for S2 about climate, that we'll come into in a bit more detail later, you would also need to be thinking about the requirements from the S1 standard and its interconnection to other issues as well. Okay, so that's just a few key concepts to get us started in Prepare, and I'll pass over to you now, Tiffany, for the landscape section.
Great. Thanks, Fiona. And hi, everyone. Happy to be here with you and to take on this second section of the Prepare section, which Fiona introduced at the beginning as being a landscape. So we've covered nicely now the why. And so let's look a bit now at how the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards were developed and the landscape of existing reporting standards. And to get us kicked off, I think I want to hear a bit from you first. So let's do another poll. And this one asks you, what frameworks are you currently disclosing? And you can choose from those on the screen, or you can maybe even give us a comment in the chat. Maybe you're using one that's not on the screen because they're not all there. So we have CDP, we have GRI, we have integrated reporting, SASB, TCFD, UNGC for the UN Global Compact. There may be ESRS being used. We see BRSR in the chat. So either pick from this list or let us know in the chat just so we can get an idea of what you're currently familiar with. And now you might be familiar in terms of using it, or maybe you've just heard of it and you know your organization integrates that into what they're doing in their reporting. So we have nearly 40% of you now. I'm going to hold out a second longer and see if we can get half of you answering. Maybe a few more can answer the question. If you are having trouble accessing the polls and you're on your mobile device, you might have to just swipe the screen. Zoom provides kind of multiple screens there. Okay, I think that's probably good. So it looks like we have an over subscription in terms of our answers here to GRI and integrated reporting, which are great. So it's good to know that many of you are familiar with those two reporting frameworks. A few of you are familiar with CDP, SASB, a few more with TCFD, and some of you with the UN Global Compact as well. And quite a few of you said other, so it might be others such as we've seen in the chat, like BRSR. I see also someone in the chat said nothing, which is perfectly okay as well. That's no problem. We'll give you kind of the overview from scratch today then. Great, so let's just take a moment to understand kind of where the IFRS Foundation is now and how the ISSB came to be. So those are a lot of acronyms. Hopefully this helps us understand them all, but IFRS, the IFRS Foundation, for those that don't know, is a not-for-profit, a public interest organization, and it's been established to develop high quality, understandable, and enforceable and globally accepted accounting and now sustainability disclosure standards. So the IFRS Foundation hosts two independent standard setting boards now. So there's the International Accounting Standards Board, or the IASB, which was formed back in 2001. And these standards are in place now in over 140 jurisdictions around the world. So many organizations are very familiar with the IASB. And now, since 2021, there's also the International Sustainability Standards Board, and it released its first two standards, S1 and S2, which we'll be talking about today, in 2023, following its formation in 2021, due to really strong market demand for its establishment. Now, governance for these boards is provided by trustees, who are in turn then accountable to a monitoring board of public authorities. And the ISSB also works closely with the IASB to ensure that their standards complement each other. Now, all of these organizations that you can see on this slide have contributed to the evolution of sustainability reporting. I should say all of these and more. So in fact, these all have a lot in common, but a range of objectives and guidelines and standards are on offer, and that can cause some confusion in the market. Sometimes we refer to this as the alphabet soup because of all the acronyms that we have in this area. So most of these organizations here focus on meeting investor needs for sustainability related information, except for GRI, which that blue circle there, which supports a broader range of stakeholders. Now, some of these organizations were then consolidated into the IFRS Foundation to form the basis of the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards. And the standards were also built on top of the TCFD recommendations. So those of you who have been reporting in line with the TCFD will also find the standards very familiar in terms of their structure and core content. And for this reason, the publishing of the ISSB standards also marked the culmination of the TCFD's work, and the TCFD now has disbanded. Meanwhile, CDP's climate questionnaire is now also aligned with the IFRS S2, and the IFRS Foundation has also agreed to take over responsibility for the disclosure-specific material of the TPT, the Transition Plan Task Force. So as a result, the reporting landscape has been significantly amplified. There is more harmonization and simplification work going on, and we continue to develop and publish guidance materials for this. Now, let's do another poll here. Based on what we were just talking about, what do you think? You can guess the answer to this question if you don't know it, but companies who are using the TCFD recommendations, do you think they automatically comply with the ISSB standards? And would you say true, yes, they automatically comply, or false, no, they don't automatically comply, something else is needed? And I'll give you just a moment to fill that in. Great, so far we have half of you answering. Just to remind you, because I see we've had more participants join since the start, do ask your questions you might have in the Q&A throughout. So don't be shy. Please feel free to ask us questions throughout the training. We have a number of experts on the call here to answer your questions. Now I'm going to share the results here and give a big congratulations to everyone. This often catches people out, but you're a very smart audience, and you caught this one correctly. Indeed, although we just said that the TCFD was absorbed into the IFRS Foundation and has now been disbanded, it's not true that if you already use the TCFD framework that you're automatically in compliance with IFRS S2. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but well done everyone who said false. You are correct. Now, one of the listing requirements that did get a lot of traction in recent years is that TCFD. So many companies are now asking what's next for TCFD reporting since it's been disbanded, and leaving the monitoring and progress up to the IFRS Foundation. So companies should continue to report against the TCFD if they are required to do so. So if their regulation requires this, they should continue to follow their regulation, of course. And until they are advised differently, they should stick to making sure that they're applying the TCFD framework and using it where needed. They may also wish to align with the ISSB, and the ISSB standards incorporate the TCFD recommendations and use the same architecture. So any company that has prepared a TCFD report is really well placed to complete a few additional steps that would be needed to be able to say you've adopted the IFRS S1 and S2 as well. And we will today go through a lot of that in our in the core content areas about what exactly is different between these two. I also might recommend you take a look at that comparison document, which highlights in a table exactly what's different between these two standards. Now, the ISSB is focused on developing standards that can provide a common language and therefore a global baseline for sustainability information. And it wants to enable comparable and consistent sustainability disclosures across global capital markets. So the foundation works with jurisdictions around the world, as well as other stakeholders in order to achieve this. Regulators and also stock exchanges then are able to require companies to disclose further information by adding their own additional building blocks tailored to those needs. So for example, a stock exchange in their guidance could suggest that a company provides additional information on top of that which is required by the ISSB. So these building blocks could involve disclosures going beyond the remit of the ISSB standards, such as GRI, or they could include jurisdiction-specific information. But we should see it more as this building blocks approach in order to reduce the need to duplicate information by having that globally consistent baseline for disclosure. And while it still allows you to report additional information based on standards like the GRI standards or even the ESRS, which we'll talk about a little bit too, it helps you have that kind of baseline that's comparable globally. So, following the launch of the ISSB standards in 2023, the International Organization of Securities Commissions, or IOSCO, which you might recognize, announced its endorsement of the ISSB standards. And IOSCO asked their 130 members to consider how they can incorporate the ISSB standards into their regulatory frameworks. And it's something we're seeing changing quite a bit lately. So the foundation, the IFRS Foundation, continues to engage with other stakeholders in addition on adoption and related issues. So for example, with the IAASB on a new assurance standard, it will shortly launch, and as part of its regulatory implementation program. So the foundation is supporting multiple jurisdictions with planning and preparation for voluntary and mandatory adoption. And it's also talking to stakeholders around the world who are planning to support voluntary disclosure against the new standard. So you can find out more about that in the link that Fiona just dropped into the chat if you'd like to learn more about the regulatory uptake. And with that, I'm going to pass on to our colleague at the IFRS Foundation, Robert. Hi, Robert. Nice to see you, and over to you.
Yes, great. Indeed. Thank you very much, Tiffany, for this introduction. Yeah, we'll be moving then to the next section in this module, in the module prepare, and then we'll be moving to the global baseline section, and I will give you an overview of the IFRS S1 and S2 standards. So far we covered business and market case for sustainability reporting, and also how the landscape is becoming more streamlined. So now we will turn to focus on the IFRS standards, IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards, IFRS S1 and IFRS S2. So moving further, before we go into the standards, I want to the standards themselves, I would like to clarify a few key terms that we will use throughout. So you will hear saying us today quite often sustainability-related financial information. And that simply means information about company sustainability-related risks and opportunities that is useful to investors. So things like climate, biodiversity, or social issues, if they could affect the company's financial outlook. Well, moreover, we will also mention general purpose financial reports, and that includes the financial statements, but also the management commentary, sometimes called a management report, strategic report, depending on your jurisdiction. All right, so next section, important one, the key core content areas. So if you are familiar with TCFD, this will also look familiar to you. The ISSB standards are structured around the same 4 core pillars, and these are governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. So each of these specific disclosure requirements each of these areas has a specific disclosure requirement, and we will go through each one later. But if you haven't already, I recommend downloading the standards and reviewing the detailed guidance. All right, so just to give you an overview of those key areas, let's now move to the standards. And the first one, S1, general requirements. So to say today, I would say, don't worry. It might sound technical at sometimes, but much of it builds on concept you probably already know. And it's important to note that IFRS S1 sets out the general requirements for disclosing sustainability-related risks and opportunities, regardless of topic. So not just climate, but also social or biodiversity risk if they are financially relevant. So it also builds on, as Tiffany mentioned, on TCFD framework, and also points preparers to the SASB standards and other guidance to help identify relevant issues and metrics, especially at the industry level. This makes the disclosures more tailored and meaningful. And importantly, also, IFRS S1 is designed to work alongside existing financial reporting standards. So your national GAAP. All right, and then moving to S2, so they are climate-related disclosures. And as the title suggests, this standard focus specifically on climate. It builds on S1, but zooms in on climate-related risks and opportunities like physical risks, floods, droughts, transition risks, policy changes, or low-carbon technology. It also incorporates all the TCFD recommendation, but goes further. For example, it includes requirements on greenhouse gas emissions, scenario analysis, and industry-specific climate metrics. And again, SASB industry-based guidance is essential here. It helps identify which metrics are most relevant to your company's activities. Prepare may or must also refer and consider the applicability of the industry-based guidance on implementing IFRS S2. And as we have said already, this is organized by industry, enabling a company to identify climate-related disclosure topics and metrics applicable to its business model and operations. All right, so we had a brief introduction into S1 and S2 and what they are, and now how they relate to each other. So S1 and S2 aren't optional add-ons. They are designed to be used together. Even if you are only reporting on climate this year, you will still need to apply IFRS S1 because it sets the framework, defining materiality, requiring connected information, and outlining how to present disclosures that are useful for investor decisions. So they cannot be separated. Okay, there are some conceptual foundations which I would like briefly go through. These are the underlying concepts that guide how information should be disclosed. The standards require, first of all, fair presentation. That means providing a complete, neutral, and accurate picture of sustainability-related risks and opportunities. Fair presentation also require, I'm sorry, and then moving to the next one, reporting entity concept requires the organizational boundary for sustainability-related financial disclosure and financial statements to be the same. And finally, the connected information. We saw earlier when Fiona explained how different risks are often interconnected. And the ISB standards require companies to clearly identify key connections, and these connections might be between the risks and opportunities, between 4 content areas we discussed earlier, and also connections between sustainability-related financial disclosures and the main financial statements. All right, now be moving to the example. I think Tiffany will present it to us on how these aspects can be applied in practice in a real life. So over to you, Tiffany.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, so speaking of connected information, I think this example from BHP shows quite clearly how they're connecting information. So this particularly looks at connections between a company's decarbonization and their investment processes. And it's an extract from the operating and financial review section of BHP's 2024 annual report. And it is part of the disclosure on how BHP manages climate-related risks and how it plans to transition to a net zero economy. And this extract describes the impact of the company's climate-related risk assessment and their climate scenario analysis on the business and capital allocation plans. So how is information connected in this extract? We tried to underline some things here and highlight in blue, but maybe let's just go through them together. So this extract illustrates connections between the company's decarbonization strategy, its financial results, and other processes. It describes, for example, the impact of the company's climate-related risk assessment and their climate scenario analysis on the business and their capital allocation plans. And in the first paragraph, it tells us that climate risk assessment and climate scenario analysis are integrated into the company's strategy, and they're treated as a sensitivity in their capital allocation process. It also shows connections and alignment between the company's capital allocation plans and rapidly decarbonizing global economy, which are taken into consideration, as I said. So some assessments are still in progress in this company, and they're very transparent about that. The company says they're undertaking studies to assess the effect of future physical climate-related risks on their operations and their productivities, as well as their costs. And the results will then be used to inform and therefore connect with the company's risk profile, their corporate planning, and their controls and adaptation measures. Now, at the bottom of this extract in light gray text, you can see here additional connections for further information on the impacts of climate-related risks on their operational activities, on their GHG emissions across the value chain, on financial statements and production, as well as revenue and expenditures. So I think in summary, this extract really just is one example of many, I think, in that report about how the effects of climate change are then connected with decisions and plans about standard business processes on operations, risk controls, and on finance. And they quite clearly highlight those connections here. So I think with that, I'm heading back to you, Robert, for the next point.
Yes, perfect. Thank you very much, Tiffany. Yeah, we'll have now another Zoom poll, and to test your knowledge and what we discussed a few minutes ago. So you should see a Zoom poll appear on your screen. Yeah, it's there. So that's one about connecting information, a key concept, and IFRS is one. And so one of the things that standards emphasize is that sustainability-related disclosures should not be siloed and should be connected with each other. So the question is, what type of connections are important to consider? And please select all the options you think apply here. So we have answer A, governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets, so 4 core pillars or areas. And then B, connections between sustainability-related financial disclosure and financial statements. And option C, sustainability-related risks and opportunities. And what is then meant by connecting information, and what should then be linked with each other? And I see most of you already answered, and the poll. Yes, and most of you answered it correctly. All of these elements, so the connection you should strive for the connection between all these elements. So A, B, and C are correct in this case. So we have different on a different level. The connection should appear, and that's all these elements you should think in that holistic way. Perfect. So now I'll be moving to the next topic, very important, and we will signal it first, and we'll discuss it more in detail later. It's the concept of materiality as defined by the IFRS foundations. So for now, just to highlight that we'll be referring today to material information, which is information that, if omitted, misstated, or obscured, could reasonably be expected to affect investor decision making. So this is the concept of materiality, which is borrowed from the IASB standards as well, and this is the same for the sustainability standards. On the next slide, I want to quickly go through some additional guidance there, which should help preparers in their journey. So during the ISB consultation on exposure drafts, one of the key feedback topics was the importance of supporting preparers, particularly those with limited resources and those in emerging markets. So in addition to the standards and application guidance published in 2023, a number of educational resources were also issued, and since then others have followed, following IFRS Knowledge Hub. And we are also in the process of gathering examples and case studies provided by our partners. So please do use IFRS Knowledge Hub and the resources there. The SASB standards were aligned with the IFRS S2 as we discussed, and to help preparers seeking industry-based guidance. And FSA credential was also updated to reflect that, with more planned to come. So please consider taking this certification. And I should also note that IFRS Foundation Capacity Building Program launched at COP27 is a key part of our support to preparers, and SSC training initiative, the one we have today, is one of the most important deliverables in this aspect. All right, and we will have now another Zoom poll, number 5, which you should be seeing right now. And this one might be a bit more tricky. So imagine this, the water is a vital input to your business, but the ISSB standards don't currently have a specific standard on water. So what would you do in this situation? So please take a moment to read the options and choose the one that seems most appropriate. So we have 4 options here. Do not disclose anything. B, consult the source of guidance listed by ISSB. Engage a consultancy to help, or copy your competitors' reporting. I think I closed the poll which I was seeing on my screen, so I don't see whether you are submitting your responses. But oh, great! Now I see now. Perfect. And then yeah, looks like I see now the results. Yeah, it's perfect. Yeah, that's what you should do. So most of you answered B. You should consult the sources of the guidance listed by ISSB, and that's indeed the correct answer here. There is the answer C is also an option and something to consider as well. Of course, engaging consultancy might be a good idea as well. That doesn't replace, of course, the consulting and the sources of guidance as issued by or listed by ISSB, but that's something which might be helpful in this case. Of course, do not doing anything about the water because there's no standard at the moment. It's not the right choice, and copying your competitors' reporting. That also should not be their exercise, and you should not aim for that. Right. So this is this ends the module 1, and we'll now hear the summary of the module 1 from Fiona. So over to you, Fiona. I think Fiona, right?
Yeah, that's right. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Robert, for that. And as you say, that brings us up to the end of our first module together. So we're going to wrap up now on this module with a few key takeaways and a bit of an exercise as well. So just to cover some of these few takeaway points. Firstly, we reviewed there together the purpose of sustainability related disclosures. And a key takeaway we're going to hope that you leave this workshop with is that there are important benefits both internally and externally for collecting and disclosing sustainability related information. So ultimately, if you're not aiming to get good use out of that data that you're putting that effort in to collect to improve your own strategic decision making, you're really missing an opportunity here, and you're going about this a little bit wrong, I guess we would say. And also, if you do have operations in hard to abate or high impact sectors, or maybe you're exposed to significant physical risks, for example, from sustainability or climate issues, your competitors could well already be disclosing these risks and identifying the opportunities that they're pursuing as well. And that's going to then leave your investors wondering perhaps why you're lagging behind them or why you're not managing these issues, which could start to affect your ability to raise funds. So it's important to be providing that transparency so your investors see how you're managing these issues. And next, we looked then with Tiffany at the evolution of disclosure standards and the formation of the ISSB and that aim to simplify the reporting landscape. And so when you're thinking about other voluntary disclosures, you shouldn't see those as competing with the ISSB standards, but rather building on top of them using that building blocks approach that we talked about. And finally, Robert introduced us there to the standards themselves and the important concepts that you need to understand in order to use them correctly. And so I think a key point I'd like to reiterate here is that the standards and the guidance that come with them are designed to meet the needs of investors. And so they're heavily focused on those prospects that we discussed at the very start of the unit about financial performance, financial effect, and financial position. Okay, so just to wrap us up, we have our first discussion exercise together, which we'll do in Menti. And so the first question that we want to reflect on together, and this would feed into this disclosure plan that we're encouraging you to develop, we'll be thinking about how you define the objectives for your sustainability disclosures. So we think it's really important when you're developing a plan to be clear on the goals that you're trying to achieve through your disclosures. So this will include thinking about the different reporting requirements that you're seeking to align to. And that could be alignment, of course, to the standards, or maybe it's also to align to several standards or to meet different jurisdictional requirements as well. And overall as well, you might want to consider with this goal the overall level of ambition or change that's required. So perhaps that will be informed by understanding, what your starting point is from reporting and where you need to get to. So let's take a moment now just to reflect together on what that goal could look like. So thanks, Tiffany, for re-sharing the Menti details there. The link is the same as before. So if you have that tab open already, you can keep coming back to that or feel free to click through to that again. So as I said, the question here that we're asking is just your immediate reflection on, from what we've heard so far, what do you think your objectives are that you're trying to mainly achieve for your sustainability disclosures? So have a little think and have a go at articulating that. As I said, this is something we'd encourage you to really socialize internally with your leadership and your colleagues as well, to make sure that there's a clear and aligned view on what you're aiming to achieve through your reporting. And perhaps which stakeholder audiences that you're looking to serve as well. I think that's something that can often be important to be clear on, as we talked about that materiality perspective a number of times already. Okay, so I've seen a few of you responding already, which is great. Thank you. So someone has mentioned aiming to learn and gain expertise in sustainability reporting standards and help organizations to implement them. Absolutely. So we should say as well, of course, we know that many of you might be report preparers here, but if you're not a preparer and you have a different role in this space, feel free to share from your perspective as well what your objectives are for focusing on this topic and maybe how you'll work with other organizations to advance what they do on the adoption of the standards. But for those of you who are preparers, I think a number of you have mentioned maybe, again, the regulatory question, and maybe that's just, a really key priority. So perhaps you just want to be clear cut with your goals here and say that you're aiming to comply. Of course, we do, as I've said a number of times, really encourage you to think a little beyond that because there's a lot of other benefits that you can get out of reporting as well. So trying to think a little bit more about what those could be for your organization is something we would definitely recommend. I see several of you have mentioned around enhancing transparency and maybe meeting different stakeholder expectations as well. Yes, absolutely. I see maybe getting a better understanding of your objectives and better using your own assets and allocations of finance. So that's great. I think, to really think about how you're strategically embedding these issues as well as reporting on them. And then I'm seeing, I've seen transparency and accountability coming up many times, and also the regulatory side. A few people are mentioning particularly transparency and reporting to your investors, which indeed, of course, is the key focus that the S1 and S2 standards are built around. So indeed, that should serve that audience well. So thinking about the regulator's perspective here as well, I see someone who's shared from that perspective. So thinking about how to adopt or what the adoption of the standards will be for listed companies and banks and developing that roadmap. So great to hear you're thinking about that. And then, seen a few similar things. I'll just have a look. So thinking about someone's mentioned to having a mix of objectives, which indeed is probably something we'd encourage you to do and think in the round about this. So thinking about both strategy, your stakeholders, and being transparent. Indeed. Great. Thank you, everyone. I think those indeed are all things we definitely recommend having in the mix. And as many of you has identified here, being really clear on these objectives at outset about which stakeholder audience you're serving. And thinking as well about any feedback that you might already had that can inform your objectives here. So maybe you've already had some investors explain to you particular topics that they want to see more information on. We'd also encourage you to really try and look to the future as well in developing this objective. So not just looking at maybe what your current and immediate term reporting requirements are, but trying to build as much flexibility and resilience to the future direction of travel as well. And as I've said already, I think we'd really encourage you to aim to maximize at outset those internal benefits that you can see from reporting and transparency as well. Great. I'll just see a few chat messages, so we'll just have a look at those as well, see what's been shared. So yes, thanks, Suvida, as well, and sharing on that regulatory and compliance piece. And I think concise is a good word to come back to as well, indeed, particularly for that investor audience and that financial materiality focus. Concise reporting is definitely a really good objective to have there. Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing and helping us to wrap up that module. I'll now hand us over to Robert, who's going to get us started with module 2.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Fiona, for this. Yes, indeed, we'll be moving now to the next module, module Align. So, and now that we have introduced the initial concepts, we will dive into how to apply the ISB standards, taking into account additional disclosures, including any relevant geographical or sectoral requirements, as well as peer practices and your leadership's objectives. So we'll have the unit is breakdown into two sections. So in order to understand how to ensure your disclosures meet global standards, we will look at the two concepts in this unit. The first and the main focus of this unit will be on how to apply the standards to achieve a global baseline for disclosure. And once we cover that, we will also discuss how additional disclosure fits. So to begin, let's focus first on how to apply the ISB standards as the global baseline. So as we already mentioned, there are 4 core pillars. One of them is the governance, and we will start with it. This includes the aspect that relate to governance body in your company and how the management is applied. So for each content area, we will discuss questions that you could ask in your company to start identifying the information that will support some of the disclosure requirements. For example, as a gap analysis. So if we look at the governance and the management requirements, we can see that there are several that are fairly qualitative. So it should be rather straightforward in terms of disclosing these matters. So the first question you might want to ask, it will be about the bodies which are responsible for the oversight and management of the processes, controls, and procedures of sustainability-related risks and opportunities. For example, is management responsibility delegated to a specific role or committee? So further, you need to ask how and often do they get informed about the sustainability-related risks and opportunities? And further, how these issues then are informed decision-making and risk management. So that could also include setting targets to manage sustainability-related risks and opportunities. And then finally, there will be a question about whether targets against this, whether these targets are linked to the executive remuneration. So for more information, you can use the SSE checklist tool. But please do remember that it's not a replacement for reading and using the full ISSB standards. All right, and now we will take a couple of examples to see what it means in practice. And we are handing now over again to Tiffany to present us how the governance can be disclosed. Over to you, Tiffany.
Thanks so much, Robert. Yeah, so let's start with this example from Yara, which is a global crop nutrition company. They're headquartered in Norway, but they have around 17,000 employees, around 60 countries, so a real global reach. So in this governance model example, we can see that Yara has a really highly integrated model with responsibilities for sustainability throughout their sustainability network, which I know this is quite hard to see on your screen because it's got a lot going on in it. But if you see that lower line at the bottom, that's kind of covering the whole breadth of the picture, that's their sustainability network, which is embedded across relevant business functions, including risk management, health, safety, environmental and quality, HR, and also global climate and energy. Now, they also have the sustainability governance team, which have a direct reporting line to the CFO and are responsible for sustainability performance and reporting. And I think those arrows that show those direct reporting lines are really important. They're really effectively using these arrows in their disclosure to indicate the flow of information and input between different governance bodies within the organization. So that's a really good practice to keep in mind. And we also want to recognize here that there are really a number of multiple governance models that you can choose for your own organization. What's most important is that your organization uses a governance structure that is not only fit for purpose for what you're doing, but also suits the particular needs of your company in terms of governance of sustainability and climate-related risks and opportunities. So let's look at one more then. This one is from Toyota, which many of you know is a car manufacturer, but including in that is also hybrid electric vehicles. So this extract we're looking at here is from their 2024 annual report. And it explains the role of sustainability, their sustainability committee within their board, and it's part of their governance structure. It is one of the business execution committees that reports directly to the president of the board of directors. Now, this particular part of the report we've pulled out shows various things that are important to include in your disclosure, such as the frequency with which the Sustainability Committee meets, who the chairs of the committee are, its members, and as you can see at the bottom, its main agenda. So the report itself then also uses a QR code, which then connects the readers to the company's sustainability policy, which the Sustainability Committee is actually responsible for. Also in Toyota, the Sustainability Committee is chaired by the executive in charge of enterprise risk and compliance management. And issues that are identified by that committee, the Sustainability Committee, are seen as being, and that are seen as being important, are then reported to and deliberated on by the board of directors holistically. And each division and group company incorporates resulting decisions into their specific activities. Now, in the final row there where it says main agenda, we actually see their specific decisions that were made by the governance body, including company sustainability targets, stakeholder input, and the strategy and updating of the sustainability policy. So just an idea of the types of information we would like to see in disclosure to be able to make sure investors have the information they need. Great. And I think with that, Fiona, I'm going to pass back to you to continue with the next core content area.
Thanks so much, Tiffany. Sorry, just getting my camera to focus. It sometimes decides to go a little blurry. Brilliant. So that moves us in now after we've looked at those governance examples and hopefully helped clarify how that appears into the next core content area, which is strategy. So strategy does have a few more disclosure requirements to include than governance, but it's also really where we think that companies can start to see the benefits from disclosure as well. So as you can see here, there are three high-level areas that we focus on in the strategy content area. And so those are risks and opportunities, effects, and resilience. So we're going to review each of these separately now. So the IFRS S1 and S2 disclosure requirements on strategy are ultimately designed to enable users of general purpose financial reports to understand a company's strategy for managing sustainability related risks and opportunities. So if we first look at these requirements, these are some of the questions that we'll want to start asking ourselves internally. So when disclosing information about risks, information required will include a description of the risks and their effects, the time horizons over which these effects are expected. And this is also where we need to keep in mind with the time horizons that the financial effects could occur before the risk or opportunity itself materializes, maybe after that, or indeed can change over time as well. And here the last question on this list in particular looks at climate, and so it aligns with the requirements from the S2 standard. And so this is where investors will be looking for information on the types of risks and opportunities that companies have identified, which is where we'll see companies typically using the categories developed from the TCFD materials on physical and transition risks, which we'll go into in a bit more detail later. So both the S1 and S2 standards include guidance to support companies to identify and disclose risks and opportunities. And they also recommend the use of further educational materials and industry-based guidance, as well as the standards from SASB. So again, we know that often an example can help us to see what this could look like in practice. So we'll share an example here from Mondi Group's integrated report. And we're using this to show how Mondi Group have disclosed the identification of different risks and opportunities for their business. So Mondi is a packaging and paper company, and they operate across Europe, North America, and Africa. And in the left-hand side of the extract here, we're seeing the particular risks across the organization that the company has identified. And so they've listed out what these risk types are, and they've aligned them with 4 key categories of strategic, financial, operational, and compliance risks. They've also identified the delegated risk owner, which is perhaps a helpful detail as well to include coming back to those governance points we talked about earlier. And overall, if we go into the report, and we encourage you always to follow the links that we've included in the slide handout if you want to read these examples in more detail, we're just showing a little bit of a summary to illustrate some of the key parts, but we know that they can be quite small, so I encourage you to read the details in the report. Then in the second half of the extract that we're showing there on the right-hand side, we can see how within the strategic category, they've drilled down further into the climate change risks that they've identified, building out both the physical and transition risks as well as the opportunities as well. And another aspect of the disclosure, which feeds through to some of the points we'll talk about in a moment, is also that they've included information on the financial impact ranges of these climate risks and opportunities and the time horizons over which they expect these impacts to start and also to be fully felt. So a useful thing to come back to as well when we talk about that in a moment. So as I've started to mention there, another aspect of risks and opportunities that is identified as having potential financial effects that you will need to disclose is the time horizons. And that really brings us back to what I introduced at the start of the session about how the time element here can be a little bit different when we're talking about sustainability disclosures. So under the ISSB standards, you're asked to identify within what time horizon any material effects are expected to occur over short, medium, and long-term time horizons. And so how you define short, medium, and long-term is going to vary between companies, and it will depend on a number of factors that might be unique to your circumstances. So for example, you should be considering your investment and business planning cycles, the strategic planning horizons that your organization uses for decision-making and capital allocations, maybe the lifespan of your assets, or even other factors as well. So overall, the important thing to keep in mind here is that you do need to define these time horizons within your disclosures. So you shouldn't necessarily expect your investors to know what you mean by short and medium term unless you've given them a clear quantitative definition for how you're using that. And so then moving on now to the second group of disclosures in the strategy category. So we started there about how you identify risks and opportunities over different time horizons. And now we're going to talk about the requirements relating to exactly what the effects of those risks and opportunities are and where those occur in the business. So to start tackling the disclosure requirements of the standards here, companies will want to think about asking themselves questions such as beginning to describe what the effects might be, both now and maybe in the future, and where those effects might play out in different aspects of their business model and value chain. They'll also want to think about what their response plan could be for mitigating or adapting to those effects. And again, we know that an example is probably helpful here. So let's take a look at one together. So we're looking here at a summary from BASF's annual report. And BASF is a global chemicals company. And this is just a quick summary visual. Again, recommend looking at the detail here. But what is useful to highlight from this example is how they've disclosed the different effects on aspects of their business model and particularly their value chain. And we can sort of see that feeding through in this summary diagram here. So overall, they refer to their sustainability strategy as winning ways. And this strategy includes both supplying customers with products that will contribute to their sustainability, as well as taking action to evaluate their own carbon footprint and think about their upstream value chain as well. And so, among other things here, we see that both in their upstream value chain, they're thinking about how they can procure and source more biologically based and recycled materials. In their own operations, they're thinking about how they can implement more efficient processes and reduce their operational emissions, potentially capitalize on energy cost savings through doing so. And then finally, in the downstream area, they're using an approach they call the triple S method, or the sustainable solution steering, to really streamline their portfolio and contribute towards global sustainability targets through what they deliver to their customers. And in the commentary that we see alongside this visual, we see that they're really targeting transitioning their growth revenue to be much more focused on circular and sustainable product solutions out to 2030. And so what we're seeing here is that they're illustrating how those different sustainability aspects affect their strategy and business model, and connecting between the targets they set themselves, their ambitions for technology development, and the financial estimates that they provide to demonstrate the potential effects of this as well. So sometimes we know that one of the obstacles that companies can face when they're reporting on these financial effects is the level of detail that can be disclosed, and in particular, the potential inclusion of quantitative information. So in that example from BASF there, we were looking mostly at qualitative information and descriptions, but what about quantitative disclosures? So under the standards, a company is required to disclose both quantitative and qualitative information about current and anticipated financial effects from sustainability risks and opportunities. However, there are a number of standards set out in the criteria of the standards for when only qualitative information is required. So this will be permitted for a number of reasons. So firstly, if a company can't separate out the financial effects of a risk and opportunity from other types of effect. Secondly, if there's a high level of measurement uncertainty, or finally, if the company doesn't have the skills, capabilities, or resources to provide that quantitative information. So that brings us on now to the final part of the strategy component. So we've looked at how you identify the risks and opportunities and the time horizons that you're expecting them to occur under. We talked about how to consider the effects of the risks and opportunities and the financial effects. And now the final group of disclosures looks particularly at how a company is prepared for uncertainties and ensures its resilience into the future. And so this really gets into the practices and processes that a company has in place to assess its resilience and make strategic adjustments where it needs to. And the disclosures here are focusing on understanding what types of assessment the company has used, in particular how and whether scenario analysis has been used, and what the outcomes of those assessments are. So we're going to dive deeper into scenario analysis in a moment, but some of the starting questions to consider here when you're talking about this internally will be focusing simply on what is the company's capacity to adjust to those risks and opportunities and uncertainties that have been identified, and perhaps how could scenario analysis be used to better understand and test that resilience. So looking at a couple of disclosure examples here. Firstly, we have Stora Enso, which is a Finnish and Swedish forest products company. And in the diagrams that we've included as a summary here, they're showing us really how they're expecting their business structure and makeup of revenue to change in the future. So their traditional business is centered around forests, pulp and wood products. But actually what they've identified is that they're expecting a lot of their future growth to come from different areas. So sustainable building solutions, renewable packaging and biomaterials, because actually they might as well expect to see a drop in the revenues from their more traditional products. And then in the diagram at the bottom of the screen, we're seeing a sort of pie chart which shows us how they expect the mix of their sales to change from 2006, how it's already changed today, and in the future, how actually they expect these new business areas to make up a much larger share of their overall sales. And so we don't have the quantitative figures against this, but we do have an immediate picture of where they're expecting the anticipated growth to come. And so in the detail alongside these visuals, they talk about, that long-term vision for their business, how they've taken on board, these risks and opportunities, and how they're taking steps now to reposition their organization. And so they talk about some of the actions they're taking, for example, to consider acquiring businesses that can support these growth opportunities, how they're investing to convert their machineries and innovate in their more traditional business areas. Now, our second kind of scenario analysis example comes from Solvay, which is a Belgian chemicals company. And in particular, we're using this example to show how you might choose to illustrate the assumptions that underlie a scenario analysis and to report on the financial effects. So in the top half of the disclosure, I know it'll be a little bit small, but you can read the detail in the report. But in summary, what they provide in this segment is a summary of the estimations and methods they've used for their scenario analysis. So they speak about the sources that they've drawn their scenarios from, the International Energy Agency, which scenarios they've used, and overall what some of the key assumptions are behind those scenarios. And that's a really important factor when you're using scenario analysis, is helping investors to understand how you've chosen the scenarios, what the key assumptions are that sit behind them, because that will help them to know, what are the different pathways you considered here. And then in the second half of the excerpt, we're seeing a disclosure of the financial effects from the scenario analysis under two different scenarios, a 1.5 and a 3-degree scenario. And Solvay have used a qualitative scoring scale from -3 to +3 to indicate the potential direction and magnitude of financial effect they're going to see from the different risks that they've identified here. Okay, great. So just to wrap up this section, a quick poll question just to test your understanding of one of the concepts I just covered a few minutes ago. So we'll see if you were listening. So the question here is to let us know which of the cases under which a company could choose to disclose only qualitative information or a combination of quantitative and qualitative information about current and anticipated financial effects. So let us know which of these, you can select more than one, you think are correct answers. So either if a company can't separate the effects of climate risks and opportunities from other effects, if there's a high level of measurement uncertainty, or if the quantitative information sheds a negative light on the company. So give you a few more moments to have a think about that. I'm seeing a pattern emerging already though, so I'll just wait for a few more of you to put your responses in and then we'll have a look at the right answers there. Okay, let's close off the poll there and I'll share those results with you. So indeed, it looks like many of you got this correct. So the top two options, as we talked about, are both valid reasons why it might be that companies disclose a mix of quantitative and qualitative or just qualitative information. The third correct option, which isn't on this list, would be also if they don't have the necessary skills, resources, or capabilities to do so at this point in time. But the final option there, as most of you identified correctly, was not a valid answer. So of course, it's important that we're balanced and transparent in our disclosure to investors. And so you saw that in those examples that we looked at there from Mondi, from Solvay as well, where they've shown how they might see negative financial losses or reductions in revenue as well as opportunities. So indeed, of course, if you have information about quantitative effects that could be material, that are negative, it is important that you're transparent to those with your investors. Brilliant. Thank you for that, everyone. And I'll hand over now to you, Tiffany, to come through into the climate aspects of this.
Great. Thanks so much, Fiona. So as we did mention, when we're disclosing information in certain areas, there might be additional requirements for S2, and strategy is one of those areas. So let's dive a little bit deeper into that. So we introduced at the beginning of this session the TCFD moving to ISSB or IFRS S2, and noted that there were certain areas where you might need to include additional information when moving to S2. So let's go through a few of those to make sure we're all aware of them. Now, firstly, IFRS S2 does require, additionally to what TCFD required, that a company refer to and consider the applicability of industry-based disclosure topics, and that's from their industry-based guidance when they're identifying climate-related risks and opportunities. Now, additionally, S2 requires disclosure of slightly more detailed information around where the company's business model and value chains, risks and opportunities are concentrated, so understanding a bit more the location of those risks and opportunities. They also, in describing the effects of those climate-related risks and opportunities, S2 requires disclosure about how a company has responded to those effects and plans to respond to those effects when it identifies those particular risks and opportunities. And the company is required to disclose any transition plan that it might be using and how the company plans to achieve that climate-related target. Also, in providing a disclosure about the current and the anticipated effects of risks and opportunities on a company's financial position, performance, and cash flows, S2 does set out certain criteria for when quantitative and qualitative information is required. So disclosure of only qualitative information is permitted, as Fiona already discussed, under certain circumstances. So for example, when a company cannot separate that information, but that's in addition to what we heard from TCFD. So making sure we're aware of what we need in terms of qualitative and quantitative information. Also, when preparing disclosures on anticipated financial effects, S2 requires a company to use all reasonable and supportable information that is available at the reporting date without undue cost or effort. And it requires the use of an approach that is commensurate with the company's circumstances. Also, in climate-related scenario analysis, which we've just seen some examples of, S2 does require the use of an approach that is commensurate with the company's circumstances and a consideration of all, again, reasonable and supportable information that's available at the reporting date. So really making sure that we are doing everything we can with our resources, but not having to, go much far beyond that and, spending a bunch of money to do various practices and processes that go much further beyond what our resources permit. Also, S2 does not specify the particular scenarios that a company would be required to use in a climate-related scenario analysis. That's up to the company to identify the best scenarios. And S2 does require additional information regarding resiliency on specific areas of uncertainty considered by the company in its assessment, and the company's capacity to adjust and adapt its strategy and business models, and details on how and when the climate-related scenario was carried out. So just to note, in addition to that IFRS S2 requires you to disclose any climate-related transition plan that you may be using. Now, it does not require you to use a transition plan, but if you are to provide details with your report readers about that transition plan. So let's go into a little bit more detail about what are transition plans. Now, a transition plan are an aspect of a company's overall strategy. So they include targets, actions or resources for the transition towards a net zero economy, and including, for example, GHG emission reduction plans. So an aspect of the company's overall strategy means that it has to bear in mind that transition plans must align with the strategy. They can't be separate from the strategy, and they must be included in the business case and motivation for transition and the levers that the company's strategy is most suited to use for decarbonization. The transition plan should also be aligned with science. It should be including what science says about requirements for net zero to be achieved, and how carbon neutrality or a Paris-aligned goals are explained in terms of the latest science. The plan also should include long-term transition goals, which are supported by activities and targets to achieve those goals. And importantly, also the interim targets. We want to know where you're heading to, but also how do you know if you're on the right track on the way there? And given the uncertainty surrounding a transition, the plan should be transparent about the dependencies for your plan to progress or to succeed moving forward. Another point is that transition will proceed in different ways for different sectors. So therefore, a sector-specific pathway should inform the development of a company's transition plan. And we are going to look at some resources that are available for this at the moment. But before we move on to those, just to note that companies should consider how the transition plan will be evaluated by investors and others, and ensure that the plan has all the hallmarks of credibility. Of course, you don't want to just throw a plan out that everyone knows you're not actually trying to do, or that there's no resources going into, or that's not connected to your strategy in any way. So we're not looking here for just disclosure, we're looking for action within the organization. Now, these are a few of those resources that you might want to get started with. So maybe starting with that first icon there, the IFRS guidance. That was on 23rd of June. The IFRS Foundation had published that new guidance titled Disclosing Information about an Entity's Climate-Related Transition, including information about transition plans in accordance with IFRS S2. Under IFRS S2, this particular guidance document supports high quality, consistent reporting on your climate transition plans, both for mitigation and adaptation to climate-related risks and opportunities. This guidance does not change IFRS S2, even though it came out after S2 did. It just clarifies how entities should disclose information if they have a transition plan. It also leverages off material from the Transition Plan Task Force, or TPT. You can see there's also a guidance document from there. And the IFRS Foundation assumed responsibility for disclosure as part of the TPT in 2024. For further details then onto not just disclosure, but really the full process, how to develop, implement, and disclose a credible transition plan, you can also make use of the SSE's model guidance on transition plans. We'll share the link in the chat. Fiona already has shared the link in the chat. And while that was developed for stock exchanges to guide their markets on this topic, any listed company may also find it helpful as it's written in the voice from a stock exchange to a listed company. Another resource you can see there is GFANZ Sectoral Pathways. GFANZ is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and they set out there the expectations that companies can use to develop their own pathways, as we were just mentioning in the last slide. And then that last resource there, the Transition Plan Task Force Disclosure Framework, provides further guidance then alongside the ISSB on the disclosure of transition pathways. And it was launched in the UK in 2022 to bring together leaders from industry, academia, regulators, to develop good practice on what disclosure plan disclosure should look like for finance and real economy companies. So well done, everyone. You made it to the break. So we're gonna just give you 5 minutes to do a quick stretch, maybe grab a coffee or a tea, and we look forward to seeing you back here when the music stops in 5 minutes. Thanks, everyone. Great. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a moment to grab a beverage, maybe a coffee or tea or water, and you're ready to start the second half of this session. Now, as a reminder, we are halfway through the core content areas. So we already looked at governance and strategy, and now let's move on to the next core content area, which is risk management. And as you can see, kind of as a high-level overview here on this slide, this category of disclosure does require report preparers to disclose information on their process for risk management for sustainability-related risks and opportunities, as well as how those fit into their overall risk management profile. So let's look at those questions that you might want to start evaluating to provide information pertaining to risk management. Now, as a reminder, in the strategy content area, we were also talking about sustainability-related risks and opportunities with a focus on the risks and opportunities that could be reasonably expected to affect a company's prospects. In the risk management disclosure, the focus now turns to how exactly a company identifies those material risks and assesses different risks and opportunities more broadly. So a company is required to disclose information about the processes and related policies for risk management. So the firm might need to start asking internal questions about, for example, what are the inputs and parameters for risk management, and whether and how sustainability related risks and opportunities are prioritized within the organization. Maybe also how the nature, likelihood, or magnitude of risks and opportunities is being assessed within the organization. Also, how sustainability related risks and opportunities are monitored over time, and whether and how processes have changed since the last reporting period. Now, beyond these questions, the standards also ask about the extent to which and how all of this has been integrated into the company's overall risk management processes. Now, similar to strategy, there are also certain considerations in S2 that build on S1 and require additional information on risk management. So let's take a look at those as well. Now, if you're moving from TCFD to ISSB's S2, there are some differences to keep in mind. So for example, you'll have to provide more details on the inputs that are being used to identify and to assess those risks on sustainability and climate, particularly here. Also, the inputs being used on scenario analysis that you're using, and on any changes to the risk management processes. S2 also requires more detail on opportunities, as these are not fully discussed in TCFD. So we go into that a bit more deeply with the S2. So let's talk about those climate-related risks and opportunities. Part of identifying risks is, of course, being aware of what risks and opportunities you should be evaluating to begin with. And TCFD specified types of climate-related risks and opportunities, as well as examples of the financial effects they might lead to, such as transition risks or physical risks. And a lot of companies found that very helpful to understand where they're starting at. So let's go through that, which comes from TCFD. Now, first, transition risks are those that arise from efforts to transition to a lower carbon economy. And they are often categorized as policy and legal, technological, market, and reputational risks. These risks could carry financial implications for a company, such as increased operating costs or even asset impairment due to climate-related regulation, for example. And the company's financial performance could also be affected by shifting consumer demands and the development and deployment of new technologies, for another example. Now let's look at the next category, physical risks, which include risks from climate change that can be event-driven, such as acute physical risks, or from longer-term shifts in climate patterns, such as chronic physical risks. Now, acute physical risks are those that arise from weather-related events such as storms or floods or droughts or heat waves, which are increasing in severity and frequency, and we're seeing those more and more and much stronger. Then there's also chronic physical risks, which arise from longer-term shifts in climate patterns, such as precipitation, temperature, which lead to sea level rises, reduced water availability, biodiversity loss, and changes in soil productivity, for example. Now, these risks could carry financial implications for a company, such as costs resulting from direct damage of assets or indirect effects of supply chain disruption. So the company's financial performance could also be affected by changes, for example, in resource availability, extreme temperature changes, and also, for example, employee health and safety. Now, important to keep those risks in mind, but let's not forget about the opportunities, which refer to the potential positive effects arising from climate change for a company if you're on top of your risk management processes. So, for example, efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change can produce these opportunities such as innovation in your operations, improving your processes, resource efficiency, or use of lower emission sources of energy, and supportive policy initiatives. So if your company has identified and disclosed a risk or an opportunity, it might benefit from this first mover advantage. And an investor could look at your sector or see your disclosure and wonder why your competitors have not identified or sought to mitigate that particular risk, or capitalized on that particular opportunity. And that could have a positive financial or reputational effect for your company as one example. Now let's look, what this looks like in practical terms, not just theoretical. And let's use another example. So this one comes from RS Group, which is a UK-based distributor of electrical and industrial equipments with global operations again. So RS Group have analyzed their climate-related risks and their opportunities for a number of years now as part of their annual report disclosures. And the company here has identified 10 principal risks for their 2024 annual report, including climate-related transition and physical risks that impact their businesses or could impact their businesses. And this extract describes the physical risks that they've indicated. So their most significant physical climate risk relates to the impact of extreme heat on their distribution centers and the potential for extreme weather events to cause physical damage and disrupt their customer supply operations. So you can see that little red wheel icon, which shows that strategically, the risk mainly affects operational excellence. And the other icon you can see, that little person, is the stakeholder groups that are most affected by that risk. And in the extract we show here, you can also see the identified business owner, also the metrics they are tracking internally to monitor each risk, and the actions they are taking to mitigate each risk. And those actions include building upgrades and associated capital investment and business continuity planning, for example. Then elsewhere in their disclosure, they also provide further information on the projected financial impacts of the risks under different climate scenarios, expressed in terms of impact on future annual operating profit. So connecting back to the strategy section we just talked about. Now, with that, I think I'm going to pass to Robert to take us through the last core content area. Over to you, Robert.
Great. Thank you very much, Tiffany. Yes, indeed, we'll be moving to the last key content area, namely metrics and targets. So let's start with metrics. Requirements and metrics are then designed to enable investors to understand a company's performance in relation to its sustainability-related risks and opportunities. So preparers should disclose information explaining how the metrics are defined, if they're absolute or relative, if they have been validated by a third party, as well as methodology. So for example, the method of calculation, what are the inputs, what are the limitations, and what are the assumptions involved. Now, that's about metrics. And similarly, let's move to the targets. So requirements and targets are then designed to enable investors to understand the targets a company has set to monitor progress towards achieving its strategic goals. So disclosure would then include the following: whether they are qualitative or quantitative, and whether it is set voluntarily or required by law or regulation. So the target should also include a metric used to that is used to monitor progress towards the achievement. It also should include the baseline period from which progress is measured and the period to which the target applies. It also should state whether there are any milestones and interim targets set. And finally, there should be also information on whether there are any revisions to the target, together with an explanation about the revisions. And we will have now pause here for the moment, and we'll have an example on these matters, on the metrics and targets. So back to you, Tiffany.
Great. Thanks so much, Robert. Let's look now at CLP, which is the largest investor-owned power business in Asia Pacific, aiming to be a leading responsible power provider. And this extract is from their 2024 sustainability report, which shows waste management and material use metrics for 2024. Including the percentage of pollution the company reduces through recycling and removal activities in line with its circular economy strategy principles. Now, these metrics are calculated in line with SASB and GRI frameworks. And in 2024, progress is compared to the 2021 baseline, which sets targets for 2025. So they're 1 year away from their target year. And the target for waste products on the first row, you can see slightly exceeds the 2025 target because of a divestment they made, which allowed them to do that. There is one more example that's in your handout, but we're not going to go through it today. I'll pass back to Robert, who will go through now the climate-specific considerations for metrics and targets.
That's right. Perfect. Thank you, Tiffany. Yes, so now we will focus on the metrics and targets, but in the context of the climate. So let's start. So as you may, and we already discussed this, the TCFD framework laid out recommendation disclosures, but IFRS takes that further by making some of these mandatory. So under IFRS, companies now need to disclose industry-specific metrics to reflect the business and model and operations. And these are designed to help investors understand how climate risks shows up in the real activities of the company. Beyond that, there are some new requirements for greenhouse gas emission. So the requirement is not just overall numbers, but also details about emissions from consolidated group and, where relevant, joint ventures and associates. For financial institutions, that also includes finance emissions. There's also a dedicated framework for Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions built into IFRS to help guide consistent and decision-useful disclosures. On one last point, why IFRS S2 doesn't explicitly say you must break down emissions by gas, like, for example, CO2, methane, and so on, IFRS S1 includes disaggregation requirements. So if showing those gases separately give investors material insights, then yes, they should be disclosed. So moving further to targets. Likewise, there's some additional disclosures compared to TCFD for targets as well. So, for example, IFRS S2 requires disclosures about how the last international agreement on climate change has informed the target and whether the target has been validated by a third party. IFRS S2 also requires disclosures of more detailed information on greenhouse gas emissions targets, including additional information about any planned use of carbon credits to achieve companies' net greenhouse gas emission targets. And IFRS 2 also includes additional requirements to disclose information about the approach to setting and reviewing each target, and how it monitors progress against each target, including whether the target was derived using a sectoral decarbonization approach. Okay, so next we'll then talk a little bit more on greenhouse gas emissions metrics. This is one of the most common topics that comes up when we talk about metrics and targets under IFRS S2. So just to recap, for everyone newer to this space, we will go through scope 1, 2, and 3 and say what these are. So scope 1 covers direct emissions. So things like your own facilities or company vehicles. Scope 2 in turn covers indirect emissions, so from purchased energy like electricity or steam. And scope 3 is everything else across your value chain. So think about suppliers, distribution, product use, etc. And IFRS S2 requires companies to disclose all 3 scopes, gross absolute emissions, using Greenhouse Gas Protocol corporate standard. And there is some flexibility here though. If your local regulator requires a different method, you can use that in your first year, thanks to the transition relief. You will also need to disclose if you use an internal carbon price to guide decision making and whether executive compensation is linked to climate performance. So just recently, not just, but relatively recently in May 2025, the IFRS Foundation published a really helpful Q&A style educational piece on how to meet this disclosure requirement, especially around scope 3. And I think Fiona just shared in the link in chat to this document, and we definitely recommend taking a look if you haven't seen it yet. Right, and with that, I'll be handing over to, oh yeah, we'll have another example. So handing over to Tiffany on the greenhouse gas metrics and how they can be done in practice. So over to you, Tiffany.
Great, thanks so much, Robert. And it seems there were no questions about the scopes of greenhouse gas emissions. So I guess we have a really great audience here that's following super well. But if anyone does have questions, please feel free to ask them. That's what we're here for. Let's look at what this might look like in practice with another example. Now, this is from Enel, which is an Italian producer and distributor, now again, of electricity and gas. And this extract is from Enel's 2024 GHG inventory report, which includes a description of the company's ambition to achieve zero emissions by 2040 and promote energy generation from renewable sources. Now, at the top of the slide, you see the company's carbon footprint broken down by scope, those 3 scopes that Robert was just describing to you. And also there is a comparative analysis of 2024 performance against the baseline year, which for them is 2022. So at the bottom of the slide, we see an extract from the breakdown of scope 2 emissions in particular. So that breakdown has various types of breakdown. The first being business activity. So for example, power generation and others being activities that are powered, that power distribution and real estate management. The other being the source. So from electricity consumption from the grid in power plants and from electricity consumption from the grid in terminal ports in particular locations. So that's the source of energy. And then we also see a breakdown in scope 2, emissions by year, comparing 2024 results back to that 2022 baseline. And then finally, we see a breakdown by calculation method. So we have here the location-based method, which reflects average emissions intensity of the local electricity grid of the company which is connected to. And then also we have a market-based method, which reflects emissions from electricity based on contractual terms. So I do see a question popped up. That's great. But while we look at that question, let's quiz you all and ask you a question. So this is another poll for you. And it asks, what is the objective of metrics? are they provided in order to enable the report users and the report readers to A, understand performance in relation to an entity's sustainability related risks and opportunities, and or B, understand progress towards any targets, and or C, understand the company's assumptions for the future. And I'll give you just a moment to take a look at that. Okay, we have about 40% of you now filling it in. Oh, we're getting very close to the 50% mark. So I'll give maybe 2 more people the chance to fill this in. Great, we've passed the 50% mark. So I'm going to share now the results. And congratulations, the majority of you picked the first 2, which are indeed correct, but quite a few of you actually picked C, the third answer there. I think we maybe tricked a few of you in this question. You've all done very well up to this point. We got a few more of you tricked on this one, but let's reiterate why that's incorrect. C is incorrect. So A and B definitely correct. So targets are to help you understand the performance in relation to the entity's risks and opportunities. It's also to help you understand progress towards any targets. However, it is not providing you with the assumptions. Targets are associated, and their metrics, of course, might give some insight into the company's assumptions. However, the requirements on resilience, so in the strategy area, are more focused on the company's assumptions about the future. So that's not the objective of our metrics and targets. Great. So with that, we're gonna now move on to the second component of our align module here. And so the first part of our align module was really looking at the core content of disclosures to meet the ISSB standards. However, as many of you are aware, there are often also regulatory requirements and other additional disclosures that companies need to consider. So before we move on from this module, let's look briefly at what other requirements are out there. Now, many companies are already disclosing against voluntary and mandatory reporting standards based on their jurisdiction, stock exchange regulation, or industry norms. So these might include things like local requirements for listed or non-listed companies to understand and oh, I just realized I'm a bit behind on the slides, I think. No, I'm good. Never mind. So yeah, those local listing requirements plus policy objectives. So companies should familiarize themselves with policy objectives aimed at promoting sustainability. Also, governments may offer incentives like tax cuts or subsidies for sustainable practices, and they may also implement disincentives for activities that counter national objectives. Companies may also need to provide additional disclosures to align with emerging industry practices and effectively manage sustainability related risks and opportunities depending on their sector and those industry standards. And then also there's other stakeholders to consider and the requirements through materiality assessment to ensure comprehensive disclosure practices that meet those key material stakeholders. I did notice someone says they have a question for 2 slides earlier, so please feel free to ask that question. Just pop it in the Q&A and we'll get to that question of yours. So what about your particular jurisdiction? Now, national regulations are actively considering how to incorporate the ISSB standards into their domestic frameworks, including decisions on timing and scope and alignment with existing reporting requirements. So it's important to note that on 12th of June this year, the IFRS Foundation published a major update on the global uptake of the ISSB standards. And it noted that 36 jurisdictions at the time had adopted, used, or are taking steps to introduce the ISSB standards into their legal or regulatory frameworks. And together, these jurisdictions account for actually 55% of global GDP. And more than 40% of global market capitalization. And if we were to remove the USA from that, it would be actually 75% or more than 75% of global market capitalization. And also, those jurisdictions account for more than 50% of the global GHG emissions. Now, with the update, the foundation has released also 17 jurisdictional profiles that show regulatory decision and alignment with the ISSB standards, and an additional 16 jurisdictional snapshots that provide updates on jurisdictions still consulting on or designing their approach. So this really marks a significant milestone in achieving a global baseline for sustainability disclosures. It provides transparency and reduces uncertainty for investors, companies, and regulators. Just to note that those particular profiles that were launched by the IFRS Foundation are in alignment with interoperability agenda. So they're ensuring jurisdictions can build on the ISSB global baseline. Also, the IFRS Foundation helps capital markets access consistent, comparable, reliable, sustainability information. The profiles complement the May 2024 jurisdictional guide that IFRS Foundation launched and are developed through bilateral engagement and independent review. And the IFRS Foundation will continue supporting jurisdictions through those areas listed on the slide, the jurisdictional sustainability consultations, the regulatory implementation program, and the roadmap developmental tool. Great. So on the other side, on voluntary standards, the IFRS Foundation is also actively supporting jurisdictions and non-jurisdictional stakeholders to ensure that the ISSB Global Baseline meets investors' needs and has good interoperability, reducing duplication and improving efficiency for the reporting system. So many of the decisions taken to develop the ISSB standards have helped advance interoperability between these standards and frameworks. For example, using the TCFD architecture as the basis for their standards helps facilitate interoperability with existing disclosure standards. Now, also CDP is ISSB's key global climate disclosure partner from 2024. Also, the CDP questionnaire is aligned with the IFRS S2. And in addition, the IFRS Foundation is working closely with the GHG protocol. Now let's look a little bit more in detail, particularly at the ISSB and GRI. So both these organizations are working closely together to maximize interoperability between their standards and align and to facilitate efficient and effective reporting by companies around the world. And I noticed quite a few of you may be using GRI already, or are, they recognize it at least. So this will be particularly important to you. We'll drop in the chat the recent mapping and information on the Sustainability Innovation Lab, which will be interesting for those who are using GRI already. Just note that on the 26th of June, 2025, the GRI Global Reporting Standards Board, or a GSSB, did grant equivalence of the IFRS S2 climate-related disclosures for Scope 1, 2, and 3 GHG emissions under GRI's 102 standard. So if your company is reporting under both GRI 102 and the IFRS S2, you're actually in luck because these standards are now aligned on their GHG emissions reporting. So Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions disclosed under S2 can also fulfill the requirements of GRI 102, providing you use the same GHG protocol-based methodology and clearly reference where the disclosures are in your GRI content index. Also, a joint statement confirms that this alignment allows you to prepare just one set of GHG emissions data that compiles with both standards, so reducing duplication and enhancing efficiency. Now, let's also look into that alignment between the European standards, the ESRS, and ISSB. Now, similarly, IFRS and EFRAG have been working closely to support interoperability between the ISSB standards and the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, or ESRS. For example, this includes a mapping of the S2 paragraph to relevant ESRS paragraphs. Many companies are actually currently expected to choose, or increasingly required to apply both ESRS and ISSB standards. And as jurisdictions around the world introduce the ISSB standards as a global baseline, now companies will be better prepared to meet disclosure requirements around the world. So there is a high degree of alignment, as you can see on these like overlapping circles on the slide, between ISSB and ESRS. And this reduces complexity and duplication for companies applying both. Now, ISSB standards facilitate decision useful information targeted at capital markets, enabling global comparison for investors. And joint guidance published by IFRS and FREG provides practical support that explains how companies can efficiently comply with both of these standards. Now, finally, let's look at integrated reporting. The integrated reporting framework provides principles-based guidance for reporting structure and content. And when it's used together with the ISSB standards, including its source of guidance, the integrated reporting framework can support a holistic view of the value creation process through governance and business model disclosure to drive connectivity between those financial statements and the sustainability related financial disclosures. So therefore, it does support then again high quality corporate reporting, and when it is underpinned by integrated thinking, it can really enhance quality of corporate governance disclosure. So if you want to know more about integrated reporting, we didn't see a huge amount of interest in that at the start of this webinar, but you do have an additional slide in your handout, so you can always read more about that there. Let's, however, move on to one more poll. I would like to test you all a little bit. So let's think about your disclosure objectives and what they should include. Should your disclosure objectives include A, the ISSB standards only, B, the ISSB standards and regulatory requirements, C, just regulatory requirements, or D, the ISSB standards, regulatory requirements, and other sources of guidance? Now, so far, you seem to be doing very well, but let's give everyone a chance to answer this poll. We have just 40%, nearly 50% now. So I'm going to give you maybe 3 more seconds to fill it in, and I'll close the poll. Great. I think that's good participation. Well done, everyone. And 66% of you were correct. D is the correct answer. The ISSB standards, regulatory requirements, and other sources of guidance. I think those of you who said ISSB and regulatory requirements are totally on the right track. So yes, start with that. But as we were talking about earlier, there may be areas that you're working on that don't have a specific guidance in them. So you might have to use other sources as recommended by the ISSB. That answer D is the fully correct one. Great. And with that, I pass back to Fiona. Over to you, Fiona.
Great. Thanks so much, Tiffany. So that brings us up to the end now of our second module. And I should say as well, it's great to see some of your questions now coming through in the Q&A. Our team loves the challenge of answering your questions, however technical and specific. So do really encourage you to keep asking any questions that you have and make the most of having our experts from IFRS with us to help you with those. But bringing us now to a wrap up on our second module. So I always like to remind people here that module 2 is a large one. There was a lot to cover. So we're well more than halfway through our time and content together at this stage. Please don't worry. But we hope that you found this one really helpful to get that comprehensive overview of the requirements that sit within the standards and those core content areas. So we, of course, took you through each of those 4 different areas of the ISSB standards: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. But an important thing to remember, of course, is although these are 4 different disclosure categories, these aren't separate issues in reality in a business, and they're very much interconnected. So encourage you, obviously, as you're thinking about your implementation processes internally, to still be connecting and not operating in silos. And we also discussed how your disclosure could potentially go beyond the requirements of S1 and S2. For example, if you need to meet different stakeholder needs, meet different regulatory requirements in certain jurisdictions, or industry standards as well. And so what's important to keep in mind when you're doing this, as Tiffany talked us through, is that the ISSB standards have been purposely developed to act as a baseline. And that building blocks approach will then allow report preparers to add additional disclosures on top. However, the balancing act here is that, of course, you need to be careful not to obscure the requirements of S1 and S2 and to keep that investor need in mind so that you're focusing on the concise information they need as well. And we'll go through some tips later about methods that could potentially help you to do that. So wrapping us up again on this module, we have another reflection activity to do together. So in Align, we've really talked through a lot of the content areas there, and that's probably bringing to mind for you already. Maybe there are some areas that you don't have in your organization, some processes that you might need, some new topics to disclose. And so, of course, what we'd really recommend that you do offline from the training is to conduct a thorough gap analysis. So we've shared with you, and we'll share it again, I would say, the disclosure checklist that we have within the SSE toolkit that can help you with this. And then within your homework assignment, there's also a simpler checklist version, which you can use as a starting point here. But what we'd like to do now together is just to reflect immediately on maybe any gaps that are front of mind for you. So these could be both gaps that are sort of topic-specific content requirements that come up from what you've heard from us, or maybe you're realizing you need some new reporting processes, new resources, or skill sets in your organization to help you here. So let's take a moment and reflect then. So I will share my screen again now, and you've got the link again to Menti if you need it in the chat there that I just shared before this segment. I see a couple of you have also shared responses already, so that's great. Thank you. So as I've said, obviously there may be many gaps, so don't worry if that is the case, but probably just share maybe one or two with us that you think are front of mind for you at this point in time that you can maybe take away to start to build out that fuller understanding. So as someone said, maybe your first gap is that you need to conduct a gap analysis. So that indeed is a gap. So we definitely recommend that you do that and use the tools that we've shared to support you there. Someone else has mentioned as well Scope 3 data as something that they want to consider and integrating international standards. And I know that's the topic as well of a few of the questions that have come up here that Roberts and Bella are helping with at the moment. Indeed, for many organizations, of course, Scope 3 emissions data is particularly challenging because it's very reliant on value chain partners in your upstream and downstream aspects of your business model to collect, and obviously for financial institutions another level of separation from that information as well when it's relating to financed emissions from companies in your portfolios. But really getting a sense of Scope 3 is a really important thing, I think, to get a feel for where material emission sources are, where potential areas of transition risk could be in the future as well. So encourage you to make use of estimation techniques to get an initial idea, and then you can focus from there on where you need to build up better data quality for your key Scope 3 categories. So we've also had a couple more responses coming through. Someone's mentioned around data again, so identifying data and the measurement of metrics and objectives. Definitely, I think that's often for many organizations a step change that we're seeing to adopt S1 and S2 is the need for more quantitative disclosures to build out more robust processes to build your data maturity. So certainly something we definitely recommend prioritizing, of course. And then people have mentioned problems with double counting and data insufficiency. On the double counting point, I would recommend reviewing the answer that Robert has provided to someone in the Q&A on that point. It's inherent within emissions reporting that some organizations will report the same emissions. So one person's Scope 1 is another Scope 3. That's an intended part of this method. Scope 3 is really about helping you to see where you can influence change with those other organizations. So, of course, it's understood that whilst that's part of your overall footprint, the degree of influence and control you have over Scope 3 does differ to your own Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. So there's a recognition within the methodologies and target setting approaches of that differing degree of influence you have, but important to get a sense of it all the same. And another person's mentioning around product CO2. Yeah, indeed, that can often be quite a difficult aspect to get to grips with. So recommend, again, maybe starting with one or two key products there to get yourself sort of piloting methods before you aim to do that more comprehensively. Someone's mentioned maybe needing more expertise and resource as well. Absolutely, you may find that there's new skill sets you need. So you should probably be thinking with your colleagues about, other consultancy resources that you can bring in to support you with some of these technical topics. For example, the greenhouse gas emissions side, maybe scenario analysis as well. But also thinking about means to upskill your colleagues, maybe hire in new team members if you think you need better in-house skills as well. Definitely good things to keep in mind at this point. And someone's mentioned the same thing about capacity and awareness. So building that capacity with your existing staff indeed is very important, and helping those who sit within different functions of the business to understand what their role in this will be as well. And maybe you need to upskill your own knowledge. Absolutely. If this has fallen on your desk and it's new to you, of course, that can feel quite overwhelming. We hope today we're helping to give you a starting point to build out that knowledge and understand where you can go for more information as well. So then we're seeing conducting a gap analysis, of course, yeah, the same points around some measuring emissions, data qualities come up again as another area. So it sounds like for many of you, that's something that you're thinking about. So a good thing to be thinking about your process for here. I think you've mentioned on many of the topics we hear coming up regularly here, but some other things we'd highlight to maybe consider at this stage as well would be thinking about your connection between your financial disclosures and financial reporting processes and your sustainability information, because as we've heard many times already, that interconnection and connecting to the financial effects of these risks and opportunities is really key, and often something that has traditionally not been considered to the same extent within sustainability reporting to date. So encourage you to engage early with financial colleagues, if you're not a financial colleague indeed, to be thinking more about that. Just see if we got any more new responses. Again, someone else mentioning around emissions data and verification as well coming up. Yeah, so either if you're actually having your data verified, that can obviously again bring in a requirement to have more robust controls and workflows and audit trails around your information. But as well, even if you don't have your data audited, you should be seeking under the standards to prepare it to an auditable level. So still thinking about those same controls and workflows is really important. So we'd kind of, I think it's great, obviously, to reflect and hopefully good to think about your immediate priorities here. But of course, we'd really encourage you to take away this aspect in the disclosure plan homework assignment, thinking more about what those different gaps are for your organization. Of course, we know that you can't necessarily tackle everything at once. So we'd encourage you, once you've identified those gaps, to think about how you can prioritize them. So there may be some areas that you see as quite foundational here, maybe your data collection, maybe your governance, for example, which you'd look to get in place before you report for the first time under the standards. But actually, perhaps there are some areas that can be things that you improve and evolve over time as your reporting matures. So thinking about the sequencing of how you act on these issues is something we'd recommend as well. Great, thanks so much everyone for sharing with us there. So we'll be starting now on Module 3, Implement. And so back over to you for that, Tiffany.
Great. Thanks so much, Fiona. Really interesting comments from everyone. It looks like a lot of people on this call might already be on their journey of disclosing climate-related information. And it's good to see those questions too, which are really, really tackling the nitty-gritty of getting this information. So please don't hold back, everyone. Whatever questions you have, we're here to help you with. Now, that was a hefty second module. Don't worry, the next two are very light. But we started with looking at the why in module 1, why disclose information, and then in module 2, the what specifically what were we looking to disclose. And now in the third module, we're more looking at the how. How do we even get that information to be able to disclose it? It's important to know that kind of the backbone of any of our disclosure is going to be the processes and practices in place within the organization. So let's dive into that. A few of you started already talking about those practices that may be missing in your current organization. And to be able to disclose this information. Now, in this unit, we have 3 topics we're going to look at. We're going to look at how to identify, how to evaluate, and how to integrate climate-related risks and opportunities and sustainability-related risks and opportunities. Now, in the first area of this unit, we're going to look at identify. So identifying sustainability-related risks and opportunities. Now, first of all, just to flag that IFRS S1 does ask companies to provide material information on all sustainability-related risks and opportunities that could reasonably be expected to affect a company's prospects. And then S2 sets out the requirements also for climate-related disclosure. So what about the risks and opportunities beyond climate? So S1 directs companies to sources of guidance that are able to support the identification of risks and opportunities and information to disclose about other risks and opportunities beyond climate, where you have much more detailed guidance. So first, when identifying which sustainability-related risks and opportunities to report on beyond climate, S1 says that consideration must be given to the SASB standards. And in addition, companies may consider other material, including the recently released IFRS educational material on material information, industry practices, and materials of other investor-focused standard setters. And I'm sure we have that. Oh, it may already be in the chat. Great. Then after a company has identified which of those sustainability related risks and opportunities they should provide information about, so what's material, S1 supports companies in identifying what information to disclose. So here S1 says, again, a company must consider the SASB standards, and companies may also refer to the IFRS educational material on materiality, as well as considering other sources, including the GRI standards and the European Standard or Sustainability Reporting Standards, or ESRS. Now, in your slide deck, there's 2 more slides there that can help you on risks and opportunities and connecting the dots. I'm going to move straight to the example, however, because a lot of you seem to already be getting those topics quite clearly. Now, this example is going back to Ayala, who is a Philippines-based corporation conglomerate, including property development and various diversified industries such as banks, healthcare, and technology. Now, this extract shows the process that Ayala uses for identifying risks in their business. The process was updated in 2024, so very recently, and it learns from previous years and takes into account of the business environment and the need for a more forward-looking approach to risk management. In Ayala's case, the first step is to establish the context within which the business operates, including looking at sources of risk intelligence from, for example, global risk reports, subject matter experts, and the management team itself. And this helps the company understand what might be the emerging risks and trends facing the organization. Then material sustainability topics are integrated into that analysis to ensure that environmental, social, and governance factors are being sufficiently considered alongside traditional business risks. And I might also note here that Ayala's statement, which I think probably difficult to see, but I'll read it to you. I think it says a lot. They say, by embedding ESG considerations into its risk framework, Ayala has strengthened its ability to anticipate and respond to emerging sustainability risks while also identifying opportunities for long-term growth value creation. So this is really what we're looking for, the reasoning behind these practices. Let's look at one more example here from Nest. So this is an extract from Nest 2024 annual report. And Nest is a company in Finland. It is a leading producer of sustainable aviation fuel, as well as renewable diesel and feedstock solutions for the chemical industry. And it also uses science and technology to transform waste and other resources into these renewable fuels and into circular raw materials. So this particular extract we're looking at here comes from the climate section of the company's annual report. It shows how the company identifies both its risks and opportunities in 2 different scenarios and over a time horizon until 2050. The effects of the first scenario, the net zero world by 2050 scenario, are considered on a global basis and for the EU and for North America in particular. So they do this because some economies may take action at a faster pace than others. In both cases, the company anticipates opportunities from growing demand for renewable and circular solutions. And on a global basis, they can expand into new markets and sectors. So in the EU and the US, they expect their supply of renewable and circular solutions to be supported by both regulation and voluntary ambitions. And they identified risks as well associated with competition and acceleration of new technologies, for example. In the comprised climate target scenario, climate action is seen as slowing, and global warming of 2.5 or 3 degrees is expected in that scenario. And so in this case, the company can differentiate itself from others by providing renewable and circular solutions. And the risk is that the demand for those products is not as big as expected, so it's more constrained. So in all scenarios, the company provides detail of the indicative financial impact they're expecting. And this extract also shows an overall assessment of whether the scenario is positive or otherwise for the company and the indicative financial effect. So because of their business model, which is focused on development of renewable fuels and circular products, the greater opportunities arise in the lowest temperature scenarios, which depends on a rapid and radical temperature reduction. Great. Now let's also take a look at proportionality mechanisms. So despite everything, identifying risks and opportunities can indeed be a challenging exercise. But I hope you're seeing that it's a valuable one. In order to make sure that the effort is proportional to the benefit, however, the ISSB standards do specify, and we mentioned this before, that in applying specific requirements, companies shall use all information that is available at the reporting date without undue cost or effort in order to disclose sustainability related financial information. So at the same time, companies are required to use all reasonable and supportable information when assessing and disclosing risks and opportunities, which means the information that the company uses for assessing its risks and opportunities should be specific to that company. This is important to understand the impacts on the actual company rather than general impacts that we might see in more broader reports. So at the same time, the company shall understand how it might be impacted by external factors. So in some cases, reasonable and supportable information includes information about, for example, past events or current conditions or forecasts, and this can then help to identify trends and potential developments that the company should prepare for. Also, just to note that the ISSB standards require preparers to use an approach that is commensurate with skills, capabilities, and resources when applying certain requirements. So what we often see is that there's a gradual increase in the detail being used in these disclosures and how these assessments are being made as companies build in their internal resources and get used to doing these practices and processes. I hope that's good news for everyone. And with that, I'm going to pass on to Fiona to discuss the evaluation.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Tiffany. So once those risks and opportunities have been identified, as Tiffany just talked us through there, the company is then going to need to evaluate the financial effects of the risks and opportunities. And we know, of course, that this can be quite a daunting aspect when first getting started. So here we're going to briefly review a few of the key concepts that can help you with this process. So to help investors understand a company's resilience against climate risk, S2 requires that they disclose information about the implications of climate change on its strategy and business model. And it also asks for the financial and operational capacity to adjust or adapt over the short, medium, and long term. So for example, you might want to test your company's resilience to a new regulation to limit high emissions activities, or perhaps its ability to adapt to changing crop yields due to more frequent extreme weather events. So to do this, you're going to then need to use scenarios drawing from climate science and analyze how these scenarios are going to lead to incurring those effects for the company. And so when we're talking about scenario analysis, it's important to remember that we're not asking you to predict the future here. This is a tool to test your resilience against potential future events. So it's about plausible potential pathways, but not ascribing a prediction or likelihood to those pathways, just understanding what those uncertainties could mean in terms of different futures. And in S2, companies are not given a specific scenario which they need to use, because this will be heavily dependent on the organization, its sector, geography, and the risk types that you're looking to assess. However, S2 asks that you use relevant scenarios, that you provide information to explain how those have been selected and what the key assumptions are that underlie them. And S2 also provides guidance to companies to determine that approach to scenario analysis. And this can encompass a range of different practices. For example, starting with qualitative scenario analysis, and then at the other end of the scale, there are more complex statistical modeling methods that could be considered as well. And so overall, the ISSB standards require companies to use an approach here that's commensurate with their circumstances and to use all of the reasonable and supportable information that's available to them at the reporting date without undue cost or effort. So now we're going to use an example again to zone in a little bit on how this could come through in our disclosures. So you probably know Nestle, the Swiss food and drinks company that we'll be using in this example. And what we see here from Nestle is an output from their climate scenario analysis included in their 2024 non-financial statement. And in this particular visual, there's a number of different analyses they've run in their report that I'd encourage you to take a look at. But here particularly, they've looked at how they might see changes in the agricultural commodities, 12 of their key commodities, and what the yield changes could look like. This is going to be under a medium emission scenario out to 2040 in comparison to a 2022 baseline. So we're seeing kind of a mixed picture overall, but generally there's quite a few of their commodities where they expect a 2% or more decrease in their yields. What this then shows in the accompanying narrative is that they could expect to see changes from increased heat waves, droughts, and water stress that could affect the availability and quality of these materials. And then in turn, that could lead to increases in pricing, volatility, and the costs of inputs to their business. And overall, the stability of their supply chain could be affected by these issues. And so in the reporting, they then go on to summarize the different outcomes of their analysis for different aspects of their business and the steps they're then taking in those different business areas to improve their resilience. So, for example, they're considering areas such as product innovation, operational efficiency, and investment in R&D, including crop science, as means to help them mitigate and prepare for these potential issues in the future. And so, of course, we know that when we're anticipating the materiality of future events, that can be very challenging to do. So to help with this determination, IFRS S1 asks that you think about a number of different issues to help you determine the materiality and the uncertainties associated with that. And so the list that we provide here is something that you can use to help you identify the steps and information needed to provide this judgment. So for example, companies should be considering all low probability but high impact outcomes. And they should also be thinking about any uncertainties relating to the company's future cash flows. And what's important here is that, of course, it's inherent that there will be uncertainties, but that these continue to be reassessed each reporting period to provide a transparent update on that alongside your disclosures. Okay, great. That brings us into the next segment and back over to you, Tiffany.
Great. Thanks so much, Fiona. So then after identification and evaluation, the third concept we want to discuss in this unit is integration. And as you may remember from the content section in the line unit, disclosures shall include a description of how climate and or sustainability related risk management practices are integrated then into the holistic risk management processes. However, this is often an area we get a lot of questions in, so let's review it again here. So some companies might already have processes for collecting the content described in the last module. For example, a company might already have processes for the disclosure of corporate governance information or the disclosure of risk management processes. And in those cases, the company can adjust those processes to integrate sustainability related risks and opportunities. In other cases, the company might need to develop new processes and plans for the integration into the company's processes over time. So some considerations to take into account when doing this is to start with a clear understanding of what processes need to be adjusted versus those that need to be created from scratch, for example. And this might sound obvious, but because, as we discussed in the beginning, these processes can often stretch across the whole organization, there might already be a process in place in another team that can be adapted to what you're looking to do. So then when assessing if an existing process can be adapted to consider sustainability related issues, it's also important to assess its suitability and whether new prioritization criteria or controls are needed as well. And another important aspect to consider is resources that are in place or new resources that might need to be added. Now, developing a disclosure plan, as you will do in your homework, is also a great way to integrate sustainability related risks and opportunities into the organization's practices and processes. It can help a company answer several important questions. So, for example, it can answer what are the company's reporting goals and objectives? Is it to comply with laws, just to comply with standards, or also to communicate a management strategy? It can answer questions like how will different goals and requirements be managed, or which audiences does the company want to communicate with, or who will be involved with developing the disclosure? For example, is it the risk management, the company's secretarial, procurement, finance, which team? Also, how will those individuals involved and the departments involved be organized, and what will their responsibilities be in this disclosure? Also, how will data be sourced, and can you use existing systems and controls, as we just talked about? And what about assurance? And importantly, what about sign-off processes? Who gets the last say? So really important to consider that in a disclosure plan. I will reiterate, a disclosure plan is not necessarily required. We just think it is helpful when you work on these things to pull your thoughts together and make a plan. Now let's come to an example from Novo Nordisk. This will help us see where they bring their reporting requirements from. We can see a bit of their strategy, their disclosure plan here, as to why they're reporting on certain information, because here they outline the regulations, their standards, and their practices that the company has chosen to use for its disclosure. So it explains the approach and scope that it's used for data collection and verification for its reports. It explains why and how changes have been made to their reporting, including how errors have been corrected. It looks at the time horizons considered for preparing information, defining short, medium, and long term, which is important to do. It also estimates or explains how estimates have been used and where to find more information about the assumptions they're using and any uncertainties that there might be, and other important and helpful contextual information that makes the report better understood. So it's important to agree to all of this information and create that plan before collecting data and putting the report together, so that the right information is being collected and there's no surprises at the end when pulling the report together. Now imagine having to go back and have to collect some information again right when you're ready to wrap up this report. So better to look at it at the start. And an added benefit is that it also helps readers of the report if you can frame it that way as well. So let's do a quick quiz and see if everyone's still awake. I know it's been a long time together already. So let's see. Is a disclosure plan required by the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards? Yes or no? Well, let's see how well everyone's been listening. We'll see. So far, maybe it's neck and neck. Okay, half of you have answered already. I'll give just 3 more seconds for anyone who wants to give their last attempt at getting this right. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Well done. 61% of you are correct. No, it is not required. However, it's very helpful, so we highly recommend making use of it. Great, and we're going to do one more poll with you. So this one asks, a disclosure plan can be helpful. Why? So we just said it's not required, but why should you be doing it? So we noted a few things, well, I just did recently as to why you might want to use a disclosure plan. Which of those is correct? A, take control of its narrative within general purpose financial reports. B, support collaboration, knowledge sharing, and cross-functional team discussions. C, act as a reference point and audit trail for disclosure preparation. And C, skip full disclosure as prescribed by the ISSB. Let's see how you do on this one. We have just about 40% of you now. I'm going to give you another 5 seconds. Great, everyone's working really quick. You're eager to get to the next bit of content, I'm sure. So well done. Yes, it is not there to help you skip full disclosure. It's there to plan your full disclosure. So it is not a replacement of disclosure by any means, but rather to help make sure that you are planning for the right actions to move forward. And with that, I'll send back to Fiona to wrap us up for this module.
Great, thank you for that, Tiffany. So as Tiffany promised, module 3 was a lot shorter, so you'll be pleased to know we're getting close in terms of getting through our content. So well done, and thanks everyone for staying with us through this. So to wrap up our third module, we'll just remind ourselves on a few key things we've covered there. So firstly, coming back to connections. So in module 2, we wrapped up by highlighting the importance of talking about connections between those 4 core content areas of disclosure. And then in this module, we've talked as well about the many connections that exist between a company and its external and internal environment. And really, these connections are what we need to focus on when we're identifying risks and opportunities. And the second thing that we talked about in this module was related to evaluating those risks and opportunities. And a key component of that evaluation is the consistency in your assumptions. So of course, using scenario analysis can be very helpful and help you to keep track of those assumptions, but it's important that you make sure you're clear about them. And if you're new to scenario analysis, as I know we've had some questions on this as well, using pre-packaged scenarios from providers such as the International Energy Agency, the IPCC, or the NGFS, and I'll share some links to that in response to the question we've had on this, can be really helpful to provide you with some starting points for assumptions that you can use to evaluate financial effects. And finally, as we've seen, even if some of this data maybe isn't data that you're already disclosing, or perhaps you're already collecting it, though, internally for different reasons. Or it might be that you do have appropriate processes in place that could allow you to start to collect it. So as much as you can, try to make adjustments to existing processes and to start building from those rather than starting from scratch. So with that focus, we'll take a little look in our reflection exercise for this module now at how we might go about this. So what we'd like to think about here is the existing systems and processes that you may have in place in your organizations for data collection that could be adapted to collect data on sustainability related issues. So here we're wanting to think about particularly what types of data that we're collecting. We also want to think about how we would manage that data with our colleagues and how we're thinking about integrating this into your organization's strategic decision-making tools. So let's have a little look at that together now. We find hopefully this is a helpful way to share and crowdsource some ideas because you might already have some thoughts about what exists in your business, but often we see many good suggestions here, I think, that would apply to other organizations as well. So it's always really helpful to share here. But here we want to think about basically what are the data sources you have that you could use? What are the processes that you're already using that you could adapt and integrate these requirements into? So we've had a couple of people respond already, and I'll give you the rest of you a little bit longer to think about this. But the first people who've come back to us have mentioned a couple of things here. So, excuse me, I'm just making it slightly bigger so I can read. There we go. Maybe looking at your audited reports. Yeah, so maybe, I'm not sure if you're referring there to disclosures which are audited, but yeah, maybe using the same processes that you're preparing for those. Or also the output of audits, maybe some insights there that you can use to help you here. So both of those angles, I think, would be relevant. Someone's mentioned industry data. Yeah, so indeed, if you don't have kind of actual organizational specific information, you might find that there are good industry sources to help you understand things. Maybe assessments of what are typical material sustainability risks, for example, for industries in your sector. And then we've mentioned as well customer feedback. Yeah, so maybe hearing from your customers about what their priorities are and what information that they give you about how they're using your products and services maybe are things that would be helpful. And then we've had people mentioning the risk process, definitely a good one to highlight here, I think, because your existing enterprise risk process absolutely is set up to assess material business risks. So as much as you can, embedding the assessment of sustainability related risks and opportunities into that ERM process is key here. And you may find that process already works well, but some aspects that you might need to consider adapting would be the time horizons that you use in your enterprise risk process, making sure there are the relevant risk categories in your organization's risk universe to assess sustainability risk types, and thinking as well about maybe how you assess opportunities as well, which could be something that's new to the organization. And then we have people mentioning governance structures too. Indeed, using your existing governance processes is great. So, your audit committee to provide oversight of disclosures, risk committee focusing on the risk process here, strategic committees to think about how you assess resilience. We're mentioning as well supplier audits, definitely a great source of information regarding what risks may lie in your value chain and indeed opportunities. People are maybe, as you say, if you're already doing existing environmental reporting, that could be operationally for compliance purposes and permitting, making sure you're getting visibility of that information as well and connecting it up to your thinking here. Someone's mentioned as well about doing structured questionnaires and interviews, often very helpful for materiality assessment, definitely. And then someone's highlighting here about using financial data sources as well, procurement systems, looking at product data, product responses. Indeed, definitely. Often we're assessing many things here, which we might not think about traditionally as sustainability related information, but for the purposes of these disclosures, it's all very much interconnected. So definitely great sources to draw on. Lots of really good ideas there. I think we've talked through the majority of those. And I think you've identified most of the things that we would have recommended there already. I think probably it would just be about data management as well. So making sure that you're plugging into existing tools that exist in your process to manage your data sets as much as possible for business performance reporting and things like that can be great to build the right cadence and controls around collecting this information as well. Lovely, thanks everyone. Okay, so that brings us into starting off on our module 4 now. So I'm pleased to introduce Bella from the IFRS team, who's going to be taking us through this module. Thanks, Bella.
Thank you, Fiona. And hello, everyone. And good news, we are now on to the final unit of this training, which focuses on the when and where of disclosure of sustainability-related financial information. Okay, so as with the last unit, we have 3 main sections. So we will look at the location. In this section, we are looking to clarify where sustainability disclosures should be located. Yeah, this is the first part. Okay, so before we dive into the specific requirements, let's think about sustainability disclosures in the context of a complete reporting package that is useful to investors. Investors already have access to a company's financial statements, and the ISSB standards are designed to identify sustainability-related risks and opportunities that complement the financial statements. These are all come together in a reporting package that we call a general purpose financial report. The requirements in ISSB standards about what information to report are based on existing sustainability reporting regimes focused on investor information needs and on aspects of financial accounting standards. And GRI standards expand on sustainability metrics relevant to broader societal concerns. ISSB and the GRI reporting standards share some content requirements, for example, what to report. But the ISSB standards are focused only on investors' information needs and decision-making, reflecting the mission of the IFRS Foundation, which is to bring transparency, accountability, and efficiency to capital markets around the world. Both organizations take different approaches to defining materiality, but they are not competing. The GRI approach is set out and understood among sustainability practitioners, whereas the IFRS approach is familiar to accountants and relies heavily on management judgment, which is also aligning with existing corporate risk management processes. So together, these frameworks enable companies to meet the growing demand for transparent, consistent information across financial and non-financial dimensions, aligning both investor priorities and broader societal expectations. A simple example is where a double materiality assessment identifies that some of the company's impacts may also create sustainability risks, which could be so significant that they are important to disclose to investors. Okay, as we just noted, materiality has different definitions for different reporting standards and audiences. So let's briefly recap what we mean by material information for the IFRS. In identifying material information to be disclosed, a company will first need to identify the sustainability-related risks and opportunities that could reasonably be expected to affect its prospects. Once the company has identified those risks and opportunities, it can then determine what information to provide about those risks and opportunities. This is where our materiality definition comes into play. The definition of material information used in S1 is based on and aligned with definition found in the IFRS accounting standards. It's information that, if omitted, misstated, or obscured by other information, could reasonably be expected to influence investor decisions. In other words, the ISSB standards seek to identify disclosure of key information that matters to investors. An entity determines what constitutes a sustainability-related risks or opportunity based on its facts and the circumstances. Entities often have well-established processes for identifying, assessing, and responding to sustainability-related risks and opportunities as part of the management of their businesses. So investors have asked for disclosure of material information, and the ISSB standards have been designed to help you gather and disclose it. However, this means that a company doesn't need to disclose information that is not material, even if the ISSB standards include it as a specific requirement. So just remember to ensure material information is clearly identifiable and that you use plain language. And also ensure material information is not scattered across your disclosure. And finally, remember to include any additional, which is non-material disclosures if required by regulators, but ensure it's clearly identifiable as such. In November of 2024, the IFRS has also released further educational material providing guidance for companies on identifying and disclosing material information on sustainability-related risks and opportunities, which would encourage you to look at for further detail. Okay, so it's time for a Zoom poll. Is about, the question is, information should be disclosed in the annual report when applying ISSB standards if There are three options. The first one is admitting that information could reasonably be expected to influence investors' decisions. And the second one is it could reasonably be expected to affect the entity's cash flows. And the third one is it exemplifies the values of the leadership team. And this is a multiple choice question. Okay, let's wait for a few more seconds to get more participation. Okay, so I'm going to end the Zoom poll and share the results. Okay, yes, well done. Most of you have done have chosen the correct answers. So the correct answers are A and B, so the first choice and the second choice. So just remember the definition of materiality and what to disclose of your material information. And I just want to explain a little bit about option C. So unless it has been determined that particular values being exemplified are expected to have a financial effect on the company, and this may not be the information that is necessary. So just to apply the materiality assessment to test whether this is material information and whether to disclose. Okay. So let's continue. Okay. Disclosure under the SSB standards has to accompany the financial statements and be part of the same general purpose financial reporting package. But as one doesn't say where in that reporting package the information shall be provided, this is designed to allow jurisdiction-specific requirements on the location of reporting. The most important factor to consider here is to ensure that sustainability disclosures are provided as part of the same reporting package as the company's financial statements. Sustainability disclosures must be provided at the same time as the related financial statements and cover the same reporting period as the financial statements and authorized by the same body or individual authorizing the financial statements. So research by WBCSD on the state of integrated reporting shows that nearly 2/3 of companies continue to put sustainability information in standalone reports. However, the SSB standards require material sustainability-related financial disclosures to be included with the general purpose financial reports. This suggests many companies have some way to go to get their internal processes and the disclosure plans aligned. Okay, so let's look at an example. Over to you, Tiffany.
Great. Thanks so much, Bella. And for this example, we're going to go back to that Philippines-based company, Ayala Corporation. And as a reminder, it's a conglomerate including property development and various diversified industries like banks and healthcare and technology. So this image here is looking really at how the company creates value and their framework for value creation. And you can see here the types of capitals that are inputs to the value creation model on the left-hand side there, and the value that's generated on the right-hand side of the diagram. And at the same time, this diagram is also used as a bit of a table of contents. And it points you to where you can find more information on this. So regarding their contents, if you look at the orange circle, well, there's multiple orange circles there, but the one there, you can see, for example, we're pointing at material topics there. You can also get the page numbers where to find that particular information. So on the company's outlook, on their material topics, on their stakeholders, they have the page number right there. The other thing to note on this example is the use of different icons. So you can see that the little skull with the wheel and the arrow on top of it on the top right of the screen there, where it says focused execution. This is where the company explains its strategic pillars. So there is a connection between the value created and the strategic pillar of focused execution. So just a way to show here a different way of communicating. They've brought together kind of all the information in one page, but then they point participants or readers of this report off to the different pages where they can find more information on this. So I will then pass back to Bella to continue on with this section.
Thank you, Tiffany. Yes, so now let's spend some time to look at the ISSB taxonomy. As you know, technology is an emerging consideration for disclosures. So increasingly, corporate reporting is moving from PDF reports towards information on web pages with structured data sets, such as those databases offered by stock exchanges. The IFRS Foundation has created the ISSB taxonomy, which reflects the requirements and accompanying materials of the ISSB standards. So the taxonomy doesn't introduce any new requirements. A digital taxonomy provides the common elements or tags needed to make your sustainability disclosures machine readable. This makes it easier to take large datasets, like information from an entire industry, and bring them all together to analyze them. There are several benefits of digital reporting, which are, for example, it makes the reported information easier to use for analysis. Data is structured the same across businesses in a machine-readable format. And also, tagging information potentially allows for automated checks for quality and consistency. And also, more and more data collection and management systems are compatible with digital reporting taxonomies, which is improving processing and report preparation. And finally, tags can have labels and descriptions in multiple languages. If you report your quantitative data in one language, someone speaking another language can also understand what it means. Okay, so that's the end of section 1. Let's move to section 2, efficiency. Following the discussion on location and timing, let's now think about ensuring efficient disclosures. We added this to the training because a common comment we found from companies is that there is a growing reporting burden. What we hope to highlight is that when done correctly, efficiencies can be made to reduce that burden. Okay, so first of all, it's important to understand what effective communication looks like and what is required. Often companies think that if they just put all the information they have into a report, then everyone will be satisfied. However, this would be against the core concepts, in particular file presentation. For example, it could be helpful to ask these questions. For example, like, is the information clear and concise? So what do we mean by clear? It might depend on the nature of the information. For example, whether it could be clearer to present information in tables, graphs, diagrams, plus accompanying text. And what do we mean by concise? To be concise, disclosures need to avoid boilerplate information, unnecessary duplication of information, and to use clear language. Some preparers watching today might be thinking to themselves that they still don't see what all the fuss is about. Perhaps their experience focuses on standalone sustainability reports, or they haven't had much interaction with external audit. To the accountants watching, I say be kind to your colleagues. Help them understand the difference in rigor that is required in data collection, oversight, sign-off, etc., for a financial statement. This means, for example, disclosures include comparative information and are to be restated as necessary. And also disclosures should be avoid unnecessary duplication and cross-reference as required. And also information has to be material, be connected, and aggregated or disaggregated appropriately. Okay, as you may have already noticed, there may appear to be some overlap in the disclosure topics. For example, you might have the same governance approach for all sustainability issues. Rather than duplicate certain information, you can use cross-referencing to enhance efficiency of your disclosures. Cross-referencing to other reports is permitted as long as the other report is available on the same terms and at the same time as the sustainability disclosures. The cross-referenced information is assumed to become part of the reporting package. And also cross-referencing shall be applied consistently and transparently. It shall not result in the information becoming more difficult to understand. So it's time for another example. Over to you, Tiffany.
Great, thanks, Bella. So this one is a quick example from a Luxembourg-based multinational steel company, ArcelorMittal. And this is to show what cross-referencing might look like, as explained by Bella so nicely. So here, ArcelorMittal map to the areas of their 2024 reporting outputs, which address the content elements or core concepts of the IFRS S1 standard, helping report users to navigate the different aspects of their reporting suite and to locate this information. This also serves to demonstrate how they're integrating their sustainability related disclosures into their wider business reporting. So for example, by embedding information on sustainability into their governance and their risk management sections of their annual report, alongside the use of supplementary reports as well to disclose further information. Now, after this slide in your handout, you'll actually find additional slides for your own reference regarding consistency of information and aggregating and disaggregating data, which I think is really useful when you're pulling together everything and integrating this into your annual report. But we're not going to go through those today. We'll leave them with you to be able to review in your own time in your slide handout. And I will pass back to Bella to take you through the rest of the section.
Thank you, Tiffany. Yes, this slide talks about mechanisms that support adoption. So we have sought to apply a number of mechanisms to support preparers get started with the SSP standards. One simple thing put in place was to adopt well-known terminology and concepts familiar to preparers, borrowing from IASB, for example. And many requirements in S1 and S2 are to be applied proportionately, recognizing companies will have a range of capabilities and preparedness on these issues. For example, qualitative scenario analysis is permitted, and you will see the phrase all reasonable and supportable information at the reporting date without undue cost or effort, or commensurate with skills, capabilities, and resources in a number of places. And this is the proportionality mechanisms we called in the standard. And also there are some reliefs for the first year of application have been introduced and include, for example, companies being able to limit disclosures to climate in year 1 and begin reporting on their other sustainability related risks and opportunities in year 2. Another relief is companies being able to provide annual sustainability-related financial disclosures with their next half-year reporting, rather than at the same time as the financial statements. And also companies not needing to provide disclosures about Scope 3 GHG emissions, apply the GHG Protocol corporate standard to measure emissions if they are already using a different measurement approach, or provide comparative information in their first year of reporting using S1 or S2. Another relief allows companies to include GHG emissions information obtained from companies in the value chain with a different reporting cycle. We've already mentioned a number of other sources of guidance and resources, including SASB standards, CDSB framework, application guidance, among many others. These reliefs are designed to enable companies to put in place reporting practices and structures to provide high-quality, decision-useful information. And jurisdictions will decide when to mandate adoption, but the standards are effective from the first day of 2024, and we know many companies are now preparing to adopt them voluntarily. Okay, let's do 2 Zoom polls to test your knowledge. And the first one is information disclosed in accordance with SSB standards should be, and this is the multiple choice. The first one is decision useful. The second one is material. The third one is misleading. And the last one is comparable. Okay. So we already have more than half of participants. So let me share the results. Okay, well done, all of the participants. I think 99% of you done correctly. So correct answer is all of the answers but C. And this obviously misleading is not the objective of the SSB standards. Okay, so let's continue with the second Zoom poll. Yes, information is decision useful if it is, and select all it apply, relevant and faithfully represented, comparable, verifiable, timely, understandable. Yeah, this is the multiple choice. Okay, I think this question is easy for all of you. Okay, so I'm going to end the Zoom poll now and share the results. Okay, so well done. The correct answer is all of the options. Just to remember the characteristics of quality information, and you will select all the correct answers. So now let's continue with the third part, and this is also the last section of our last unit. And this section looks at how you can ensure that the users of financial reports have confidence in the data you are disclosing, as trust is an essential component of sustainability-related disclosures, and increasingly so with the growing concerns over greenwashing. Okay, so the first one, we talk about comparative information. An important trust builder is showing data and trends over time. This is why SSB standards ask for comparatives. Comparative information provides context, helps to indicate progress, and underpins strategy and risk management. A metrics disclosed by a company might be redefined or replaced over time. All the company might change its method for estimating a metric. In these situations, it is important for the company to revise the comparatives to enable investors to compare and analyze current period figures with the relevant prior period figures. Occasionally, a company's sustainability disclosures might contain material errors. In this situation, the company is required to restate these errors in the comparatives provided. And also revisions or restatements are necessary only when there is a risk that material information being omitted, misstated, or obscured as a result of not revising or restating the comparatives. And finally, information can be qualitative and quantitative. And companies sometimes express concern with sharing information they deem to be sensitive or that if shared should deplete their competitive advantage. The SSB standards relieve a company from disclosing information about a sustainability-related opportunity if that information is commercially sensitive. If this is a concern you have, there is further detail you can read in the handout. Okay, finally, it's important to build confidence by providing clear statements of compliance. A company that complies with all requirements in the SSB standards, even the reliefs, is required to make an explicit statement of compliance. We also published further guidance on this in September of 2024, called Voluntarily Applying SSB Standards, a Guide for Preparers. Okay, so things to remember. You can see 3 parts on this slide. So the first one is ensure information is relevant, material represented faithfully, comparable, verifiable, timely, understandable. Remember the Zoom poll we did just now, and this is the characteristics of quality information. And second part, a few things to remember is the connections. And this, just to remember that 3 aspects of connections: sustainability-related risks and opportunities, disclosures on core content, the 4 pillars, and finally, sustainability-related financial disclosures and the financial statements. And the third part, as you can see on the slides, the same period, same reporting company, and material information and material assessment, investor focused, comparatives, and also finally the statement of compliance. Yes, that's all for me, and over to you, Fiona, for the summary.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Bella. And that brings us to the end of our final content module. So big well done, everyone, for working with us through the program. So we'll wrap up this module now before we finish off with some closing resources and sharing that all important certificate information as well. So just to wrap up quickly on this module, we'll take a moment here. So I think what we really focused on that was important here was the audience and who you're reporting to. So make sure to be clear from the start who the primary user of this information is, and that's going to really help you to ensure that the information you're providing is right for their needs. And of course, as we've mentioned a few times here, when we're talking about S1 and S2, that's an investor audience. We then discussed efficiency, and I think a key takeaway here is that less is more. So the objective is not to overload investors with information, because actually that could be harmful and obscure what's material. So using the standards here as your guiding focus to make sure that your disclosures are concise, decision useful, and investor focused will be important. And finally, we've finished there by talking about report user confidence, and especially in the current climate of greenwashing, which I know someone has asked about as well, it's very important to ensure that the data that you are providing is not only accurate, but is presented in a way that builds confidence among report users. And so that's where the disclosure reporting plan that we've been discussing throughout the training today, and we'd encourage you to develop, is something that can really help you to do this and to have a clear and documented process for reporting to your investors. All right, so to wrap us up, we're going to do probably quite a quick Menti exercise. We'll just go into Menti now together, but it's really to get your thoughts from those different techniques that there might be to make reports easier to navigate. Oh, excuse me, I'm sharing the wrong screen there. There we go. Sorry for that. So if it's easier really to use some of these techniques that you can help navigate, so might be to share the techniques that we talked about already and let us know which ones you think are most helpful, or maybe if you have any other ideas as well of techniques that you've seen or that you use in your organizations, feel free to share those as well. So I've seen table of contents and charts, effective labeling, find field maybe, so having a way to search the document, I think maybe is what you're referring to there. Great ideas. So I think a lot of those draw from what we talked about, but having links and using examples, having cross-referencing indeed. Thanks everyone. Using data management systems to structure your data, I think you mean there. And I think, yeah, all things we definitely encourage. So the only other things I think maybe you haven't seen there already is just having a navigation panel perhaps in your report so that you can see which section you're in at the time. And of course, thinking about the digital interactivity of our reports beyond them just being PDFs. And thanks everyone. I think a few more helpful things coming through there around linking between report sections, maybe using charts and visuals, of course, as well to illustrate data and accompany narrative. So that's great. Often charts can help us to say things in less words as well than a narrative disclosure might, which is always useful. Great. Okay, so one final quick question to wrap us up is just to go back to those objectives that we set ourselves at the start of the session and to get a sense of hopefully how we've helped to move along your understanding and comfort on these different topics. So if you can take a moment just to vote, that's always really helpful for us to know. Hopefully we're helping you in these areas, but if we can't, we obviously want to make sure our training is doing that. So if you can vote and let us know where your understanding is at now with each of those tasks, that would be great. Okay, I see one person was very much feeling more confident, so that's great. Seeing some more responses coming in now and a little bit of a mix, but overall, I think we were down in the twos at the start of the session. So if we're up in the threes, close to four, that's great to see. So thanks everyone for that feedback. And indeed, more feedback is something we'll be able to discuss through the feedback survey as well. So just taking us back then to a couple of quick slides to wrap things up. So we've mentioned several times the homework assignment. Just as a quick reminder, this isn't mandatory. It's just something we've developed to help you to continue your learning and as a structure for that disclosure plan we've talked about there. So just as a final reminder, you can access that under the resources section of the event page for today that we've shared with you a number of times, along with the slide handout containing all the hyperlinks and different guidance that we've shared with you today. We've also mentioned a number of resources that you can go back to as a good repository for general information. So we'd highlight again here the IFRS Knowledge Hub as a great resource to get guidance, resources, case studies, and to see more webinars as well from the IFRS team about different topics. There's also the 4 free e-learning modules developed to support adoption of the standards. These are self-paced and have CPD credits attached to them as well. So a good way to continue to deep dive on your understanding of these topics and also perhaps to share with colleagues who weren't able to join us today who might want to know more about these topics as well. We'll also highlight as well, of course, the standards themselves as the great place to go. No better source of the truth than the standards to read about the detail here. And finally, from the IFC, we'd like to mention as well another great resource called the Beyond the Balance Sheet and Disclosure and Transparency Toolkit. In particular, these resources are great at kind of supporting internal implementation of corporate governance practices, but cover a whole suite of things and are particularly focused on supporting those in emerging markets as well. So make sure to check the IFC resources out if that is of interest for you. A final reminder as well of the SSE toolkit that we've referred to and connected to as resources a number of times here. We hope this is a helpful suite of resources to help you advance practical implementation of these issues in your organizations. And so that is coming towards the end, really bringing us to a big thank you for all of you who stuck with us and a well done for completing the 3.5 hours of training together. We do know that this is a long time to be together in an online environment and there is a lot to learn and cover. So as a thank you for the hard work that you've put in, you're now able to receive a CPD certified completion certificate for taking part in the training. So to get your certificate, you'll need to follow the link that's just been shared with you by Tiffany in the chat now. If you complete the feedback survey at this link, we will then send out your certificate to you at the address you complete the survey with. So a couple of things to bear in mind here. Firstly, we'd love to have your feedback on the program, so do please take the opportunity to let us know your thoughts. Secondly, sometimes these certificates can go to spam. So we recommend, if you know that your organization's email filters are quite strong, maybe to use a personal Gmail account, for example, to fill out the survey. And also, if you missed the link in the chat there that's just been shared, keep an eye out as well for an email that you'll receive from Zoom within the next 24 hours, or 24 hours from now, I think, in fact, and that will share with you that same link to those who participated live with us again in the program. So yeah, if you can give us about a week to receive your completion certificate after the training is completed, because we send those out each week, that will be great. But otherwise, check your junk folders and do contact us if you do have trouble receiving your certificate after a week of completing the survey. But otherwise, all that remains from my side is to say a big final thanks and words of appreciation to a few different organisations. Firstly, to the SSE supporters who provide ongoing mission support to the SSE's programme. Next, of course, to the IFRS Sustainability Capacity Building team, and particularly to Robert and Bella, who've joined us today in the session. A big thank you as well to the IFC for their ongoing support for this programme. And of course, a thank you to the Macedonian Stock Exchange and Carolina for hosting us together today for this training session. It's great to have brought this training together to your market. And last but not least, of course, a big thank you to all of you who've joined us here today, engaged with us in the session and shared your thoughts and feedback. We greatly appreciate it. So we will close out the session there, but a big thank you again for joining us. And on behalf of myself and Tiffany at the SSE Academy, thanks again, and we'll hope to see you again at a future training program. Thanks, everyone.